Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone had a good night, a good dinner, etc. And I think we should get started right away. So I will go and give the director's report. Well, as per usual, I have a lot to tell, although maybe sometimes a little bit, sometimes less to tell than I sometimes do. The first news is the budget, and obviously we don't have a budget yet for next year. There are some proposals. You know that NIH has, since 2016, been getting increases in its budget of $2 million from 16 in 16, $2 million in 17, $3 million, that was the great one in 18, $2 million in 19. We really don't know what's going to happen in 20, although what we are hearing from the appropriators on both sides, both chambers of the House on both sides of the aisle, is that I think it's likely that there'll be continued increase. The president doesn't like that. His budget continuously every year is proposing very large cuts to NIH. We don't think that it's likely that that will happen. Congress, again, is very positive. I should say, though, that we have to spend a heck of a lot of effort planning for the reduced budgets in the congressional justifications that we do each year. But we do have the marks for from the House, not from the Senate yet. The House did mark up, I think about a month ago, or at least a couple of weeks, a House Appropriation Subcommittee and then the Appropriations, that for a essentially a $2 billion increase for 2020 for NIH, which translates into, and it's really nice, and I don't totally understand it, but about a $36 million increase for NIH. Last year with a $2 billion increase for NIH, we only got about a $24 million. This year we're going to get more. There's about a 4.59% increase in the budget for us and for all the other ICs that don't have specific earmarks, like brain or the cancer moonshot, that kind of thing. So Superfund, hallelujah! As you know, when once at the end of the shutdown, Superfund finally got an increase in FY19, the first increase from FY19. That took us up to $79 million, which was just under where we had been in 2012. The House proposed mark is an additional $1 million. We are guardedly optimistic that maybe the Senate will decide to do a little bit more, which they have done several times in the past. But anyway, I think it's encouraging that 2020 is looking quite positive, we hope. Anyway, I should mention that I believe the other night, and I see Jed and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the other night the House passed the disaster bill, which was about $19 billion that had been taking its while, been passed by the Senate a while ago. The president had said he would sign it, and that does have $1 million for the worker training program related to some disaster response efforts. That is no year money, so they don't have to spend it all in the year that they get it. And that there is some language, but the Senate hasn't marked up anything yet, but in the appropriations for the Department of Energy, which passes on $10 million every year for the nuclear cleanup hazardous waste response for WTP, as another $10 million. So we think likely that that'll be a direct pass through again. So at this point, the budget looks relatively promising. I would say for the first time in quite a number of years, there is congressional interest in science, at least in some of our kind of science, at least on the House side. And I did my second hearing, this was on the Senate side actually, from the Environment and Public Works Committee, looking at PFAS. Now, when I say second hearing, some of you may remember that I testified before a different Senate committee last September, also on the topic of PFAS. I think everybody is pretty familiar with this topic now. It's not going to go away. Concern is rising. There are more and more, there's concern again on both sides of the aisle. At the hearing, there were 13 members on that subcommittee. There were nine of the members actually came. I was asked questions by John Barrasso, who is the chair of the committee, Republican of Wyoming, and by Tom Carper, who is the ranking member from Delaware, and Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. After the hearing, we always get questions after the testimony. And I've got a bunch of written questions, which we've just hopefully finalized the responses to. And they were from not only Barrasso and Carper, but also from, let me see who the third one was from. Edward Markey was the other member of the committee who asked lots of questions. And again, that all becomes part of the official transcript. We've also been having our usual staff briefings, and it's kind of frustrating to me that we rarely get the opportunities to brief the Health and Labor Subcommittee for Appropriations, but we often get to brief the Environment and Related Agencies subcommittees, and these are the committees that fund EPA, ATSDR, and our Superfund program. And so we had both meetings in March, I think, and then a little bit more recently, where we've met with the ranking staff members both on the House and the Senate side. Well, I'm sorry, we met with both the chair, staffers, okay, that doesn't sound right. We met with the lead staffers for the chair and the lead staffers for the ranking members of both the House and Senate. They call this the Four Corners, where you have the House and the Senate subcommittees that fund this effort. So Betty McCullen is the chair on the House, and David Joyce is the ranking member. Lisa Murkowski, who we meaning NAEHS, have worked with a number of times, is the chair in the Senate, and Tom Udall's the ranking member. I'm sorry to say that Senator Udall, who just completing his second term in the Senate, just announced that he is not going to run again. And he has been a friend and a supporter, and actually, I think, a pretty good senator. He feels like he can accomplish more outside of the Senate than inside the Senate, which is kind of a sad comment. There were some interesting questions that they wanted to know. They were interested in how we design our RFAs for Superfund. And they wanted to know who selects or suggests scientific topics for the research that Superfund does. You know, we let them know that these are investigator-initiated programs. We let people know what we're interested in. They were interested in how we interacted, for example, with EPA and ATSDR, and we let them know the crucial role that they play in our Superfund programs. And then there was one specific science question, which I thought was kind of interesting. They were very interested in how the worker training program deals with mold remediation. And I think some of that has come out of what they've heard from all the flooding that has occurred with the hurricanes, and of course what's going on right now in the Midwest and so on. That's a question of interest for people. So there have also been a couple of other congressional hearings related to environmental health that we were not specifically involved in. None of these had federal panelists involved. But the first one was looking at the House Oversight and Reform Committee, and these are all on the House side. So there is a lot of interest in the environment on the House side, looking at the public health risks of carcinogens in consumer products. Then there was one, this was especially interesting, the health and environmental impacts of mountaintop removal mining was the hearing, and looked at Appalachian Communities Health Emergency Act of 2019. This is called ACHE Act. This has been proposed before. It's had lots of sponsors, but only on the Democratic side of the House. It probably wouldn't go anywhere, but this would require basically a ban on mountaintop mining until research is conducted by NAEHS, and I believe that the way that the act is written, that would be funded by the mining organizations to look at the potential health effects. One of the members of the committee here there was a mine owner who was one of the members, and another was Mike McCauley, who is a investigator at University of West Virginia, who has published on the potential adverse health effects in mountaintop mining communities. I think some of you may know that NTP did kind of a scoping review of what of what the data said related to health effects of mountaintop mining, and concluded there was certainly potential for adverse health effects, but there really wasn't adequate data to demonstrate it. There really was a need for study. And then the Homeland Security Committee, the Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, looked at the Homeland Security impacts of a changing climate. Obviously, the whole climate change issue, or the impacts of climate on health. We don't often talk about climate change, but we talk about how our climate impacts our health, was very relevant to us. So most of the time I'm going to spend today is talking about some exciting science that NIEHSers, both here and extramurally, are doing, and realize this is just kind of, what shall I say, just almost a grab bag of some, what I would say is some kind of hot stuff. The first is one that involved both NTP and DIR, and this was one where they looked at the role of DNA methylation in mice. They mated the two strains that are used in the NTP bioassay, the C57 Black 6 and the CBH3, and they looked both at the parental and the offsprings, and they looked at what happened during pregnancy and so on. And again, some of the things that they found by intercrossing these different strains of mice, is they found that some of the methylation patterns were restricted to female animals that had been pregnant. They also found that the CpG methylation was extremely stable across generations, and that there were sex-specific differences in the DNA methylation that occurred, and suggesting that the CpG methylation could serve as an epigenetic record of life events in somatic tissues, where their expression is linked to relevant biology. So that was kind of an interesting, actually a very large, complicated study that took a couple of years to do. The next one I think is another one interesting, again, involving our two intramural programs, looking at non-genomic signaling pathways for BPA in human uterine leiomyoma cell proliferation. And this one, I think some of the key facts are that these are immortalized cell lines, but there was a non-monotonic dose response curve here, where different things happened at the very low doses in the region compared to much higher doses as well. And I think the important thing here was that they got proliferation of the cells, again, through this membrane-bound form of the receptor, with activation of SERC and EGFR and RAS and MAP kinase. So again, the importance of realizing that frequently with endocrine disruptors, you're not looking at a single pathway. There are going to be multiple pathways, multiple receptors, both nuclear and membrane bound, which I think is important to understand. John Sidlowski's lab studies glucocorticoid receptor and glucocorticoid action, and has published some really exciting work lately, but this I thought was an especially interesting one, where the essentiality of endogenous glucocorticoids to prevent prevent inflammation from occurring, and therefore by preventing gastric metaplasia. That was like kind of, we've got glucocorticoid receptors everywhere, and most of the time we don't know what they're doing. But again, they often turn out to be extremely important. I think the next paper is a very exciting example coming out of Robin Stanley, who's one of our tenure track investigators, using the cryo-EM capability that we've developed here in concert with UNC and Duke. We have our own cryo-EM, but there's a fancier one that they've got over at Duke, and looking at the essential ribosome assembly of this ATPase, this specific protein, which is absolutely key in the assembly of the 60S, or the 6, related to the 60S ribosomal RNA and the large ribosomal subunit. Okay, so this is another study showing the advantages of doing prospective longitudinal studies where you follow people. This is coming out of the sister study, which I think you're all familiar with, is the study of 51,000 women who were relatives or had sisters who had breast cancer. And then over a 6-year period, over 2,000 of these women have developed breast cancer themselves. I mean, we designed this study, we is Royal We, not me, Dale Sandler and her cohort. This study was designed really to increase the risk, since we know that there is a increased risk if you have maternal, either mother, sister, grandmother, and so on, had breast cancers and increased risk. And there's been proposals that methylation is a good marker for biological aging. And in fact, this following the women who developed breast cancer versus in a kind of case control approach, those from the study who did not, what they could see that the women who were kind of biologically older by having higher levels of methylation were at increased risk of breast cancer. So that is potentially suggesting there might be a marker there. This is another one that I'm actually really kind of excited about, looking at the PPA gamma role in adipogenesis. I think many of you know that you kind of had adipogenesis and bone marrow or bone development, and they're kind of on two sides of the scale. And if you increase the adipogenesis, you may end up with problems with bone density and bone growth. And this is looking at dietary phytoestrogens. And, we all think about miso soup and think, oh, how good it is for us and the low incidence of breast cancer, for example, in Japan. And then when the women come here, they don't have it. Well, there's some evidence from this that resveratrol, for example, and is an antagonist of PPAR gamma and actually has significant adipogenic effects, while in contrast, genistein, for example, is a PPAR gamma agonist, and you get the bone density impacts, but also had some pro-adipogenic effects. So the conclusion of the paper is that pro or anti-obesity effects of phytoestrogens are related to their relative agonist-antagonist activity of PPAR gamma. And I guess one thing that I really like about this whole approach is that, there's been so much focus on PPAR alpha. And, I really think this may be, I shouldn't say more important, but certainly equally important, and looking at different kinds of health outcomes as well. Okay, so dietary supplements and botanicals. I think the issue here is we know that there are hundreds of them, thousands of them. Actually, what you buy today is not what you bought yesterday, even if it has the same label on it. There's really limited information, but developing Tox21 some of the high throughput screening assays in order to at least prioritize and evaluate which ones may be more or less problematic. And then this one is kind of looking at planarian, the flatworm, as a potential screen for neurotoxicity. We've been looking at, Royal We and DP has been looking at, for example, C. elegans and zebrafish, and now also looking at planaria. And they looked at 15 different flame retardants. Some of the highly used brominated flame retardants like the PBDEs have been removed from the market. There are other brominated ones that are still out there, like TBBPA, which we heard a little bit about yesterday and some of its effects. But there's been a move to the organophosphate flame retardants. And in fact, what this shows is that at least 11 of these 15 flame retardants, half of the brominated ones and most of the organophosphate ones, they were essentially equitoxic and were showed neurotoxicity in this model, again suggesting that the move to the OPFRs is probably another example of unintended or substitution, ending up with compounds which may be as bad as what we started off with, or maybe worse. So, to talk to some of our grantees and some of their exciting work, this is a very interesting one. Katie Burns is a former NAEHS intramural postdoc who is one of our she was a K99 awardee as well, and was at the University of Cincinnati. Shook May had recruited her and then left. But anyway, looking at the increase in serum cytokines, some are associated with endometriosis, some are associated with uranium exposure. Uranium can act as an estrogen, And there are some in common. So again, trying to tease out this system. Endometriosis is a really a very, can be an extremely terrible health condition for reproductive age women, and has had NIH as a whole is spending Zippo on it. I think a total of about $10 million out of a $10 million out of $39 billion budget. And approximately 10% of reproductive age women suffer from endo. And so that we are very interested in additional work and the environmental contributors to it. This was a really interesting one, I thought, related to the mechanism. Toxic E. coli strains secrete a colobactin, which is a molecule that can alkylate DNA. And using in vitro studies, and then with even some in vivo mouse studies, they were able to demonstrate that you could actually have a signature from this colobactin DNA adducts that were formed. And this one, the somatic mutations increase hepatic clonal fitness and regeneration in chronic liver disease. I think this is, we'll hear much more about chronic liver disease this afternoon from Matt, right? Right? I assume so. But I think the point here was that in cirrhosis of the liver, you have different mutations. There's a lot of heterogeneity, and some are more fit at surviving than others, and certain mutations are worth. But again, the increase in mutations that normally occurs with age, but some actually will then lead to the clonal expansion, so on. Okay, so Wei-Si Chu and Engelhardt, Wei-Si is at Texas A&M, has been working on developing dose response modeling for chemical exposures and trying to develop mixtures. And he's trying to tie this to an illness severity model. I can't say I totally understand this paper. I've read it. But I think it is proposing some models that may, in fact, be better than the models that we've traditionally been using for dose response assessment. Can actually, for example, a typically monotonic increasing dose response function can display a J-shaped, which is what we're seeing here, kind of the J-shaped function, if there's an antagonistic common mode chemical present there as well. And again, some of the work they're doing here is providing an accurate statistical description of samples of observed dose response data. So again, this has to be explored with a lot of different additional data sets, but may be a very useful model for dose response assessment. This paper coming out of Hopkins with looking at the early cohort for autism, involving some of our investigators, Craig, who used to be, he's at Penn State now, right? But used to be at Drexel, and Irva Hertz-Pucciota at the Mine Institute, and UC Davis, and Lisa Crum with Kaiser, and Heather Volk, who most of this group are at Hopkins, are looking at the epigenetic marks, and they looked at cord blood and the placenta tissues, and found that in fact that there was a fair amount of overlap between cord blood and placenta for when in association with exposure to ozone or NO2 were the pollutants that they were looking at, and that again there was a fair amount of similarity between the two. And the differentially methylated regions, some of them, it depended upon what they were looking at with the exposure. They found some sex-specific differentially methylated regions that were associated with prenatal ozone, and they found additional ones which were found in cord blood samples, which were related to the DNA in the placenta. Okay, that's it for the science per se. I want to spend some time talking about environmental health perspectives. I think many of you know that many of us in the environmental health community have gotten frustrated with EHP. There was a time where it took sometimes 2 years to get a paper out. I wanted to let you know that EHP has been totally revamped. We have a new process, faster publication, and we want would like you to help spread the word about it. There is an editorial that just came out from Sally Darney, the editor-in-chief, talking about all the changes that have been made related to publication management. The editorial and publishing workflow is refined. Very honestly, we find now that what delays getting papers out is the author's response to questions. There's continuous open access online publication, and there's no cost to the authors. And again, here's the editorial. Our impact factor this year dropped a little. We're not really sure why, but the 5-year average is almost 10, and we're optimistic that it's going to go back up there. We're the second out of 94 tox journals, the fourth of 241 environmental science journals, and the fourth of 180 public health journals. And again, the continuous open access free publication should be a draw to people. Well, I mentioned Sally has led the effort to totally revamp their journal, but Sally's also decided that it's time for her to step away. She's hoping to retire by the end of the calendar year. And we're in the process of beginning the recruitment of a new editor-in-chief. Rick, did the announcement go out yesterday? Do you know?
Actually, yes, it did.
Okay. We're changing the model. We're looking for someone who might want to do this as a part-time effort with their other commitments. We're looking for them to be involved in this for a 4-year time period. They don't have to be here. Obviously, they would have to come and visit, but they don't have to spend their time here. And if they wanted to, they would certainly be able to maintain their own research or their program at their home institution. So the editor-in-chief sets the strategic directions. I'm not the one who sets it for EHP. There is a hard wall between institute leadership and the journal. There's, as I said, editorial independence. The editor-in-chief works with the broader environmental community, appoints and guides a distinguished board of associate editors, and we have now recruited a professional operational and scientific editing teams on site. So we're looking for people to be interested. If you are interested, please let us know. You can send Rick or myself an email. We have a search committee that's just gotten started. I'm looking at Jose, who I know is one of the members of the search committee, but we have international representation on the search committee as well. So if you know of someone who's interested, I want to say we've had a number of people who have already expressed it. There were a few people that we invited to be on the search committee who said, well, I think I might be interested. So they're not on the search committee, but we'll see. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to talk just for a minute about is children's environmental health. You're going to be hearing more about going forward in that area, but I wanted to just mention some of the large efforts that we have ongoing as well. We have been playing in part because of our role in the Children's Environmental Health Task Force, which was something initially established by Bill Clinton's executive order in 1997 and has continued with a few hiatuses, but is back up and running. That task force is co-chaired by the head of EPA and the head of HHS, but that has developed a federal-led action plan, and the goal 4 does have to do with research. We're looking on developing a webinar series this summer for federal partners and federal agencies, and there will be a federal interagency meeting dealing with the impact of lead on children's environmental health and how we can avoid it, basically, and or possibly have preventative measures. That will be held at NIH up at Natcher the beginning of December. Many of you are aware, and some of you are participants in the ECHO effort, which is the Environmental Children's Health Outcomes. This is the program that developed out of the National Children's Studies demise. It's led by Matt Gilman in the office, Dr. Collins' office. And there's a strategic planning task force. Sue Shantz is one, I know, a member of that task force, as well as I think a bunch of our other grantees, Rebecca, Leo, Susan Tattlebaum, and Sheila Narayana. So I think there are 14 members of the task force. I think we're pretty well represented on it with 5 NIEHS grantees involved with it. It might be interesting at another council meeting to actually get a report on ECHO and how things are moving there. There's another study which, again, there's a perspective that's just being written for JAMA by Nora Volko and other people involved in the HEAL BCD study. There's a study looking at opioid addiction or opioid and drug effects on children called the ABCD study. That study began a few years ago, is recruiting about 10,000 9 to 10-year-olds, and is going to be following them with doing lots of brain imaging and behavioral assessments and so on. Well, they've now initiated, under the Common Fund, a study that's going to start with babies and recruiting infants, and we are participating in this new effort. The call was already out there. The applications will be reviewed. The grants will be awarded in the kickoff meeting. But stay tuned as this moves forward. There are environmental indicators or environmental measurements that will be associated with some of this study. And then the Federal Disaster Research Response and children. We're trying to, look at children as obviously a population at special risk. And this will be likely coordinated with the environmental health risks, with the President's task force that I talked about related to lead. So, say goodbye to where you're sitting. This is an amazing building. It's not new anymore. It's approaching 40 years old. A building of that age has problems. And we have had issues with the fire marshal, that we have issues with potential flammability of all the wood in this room. Yeah, don't look so hard, Bob. It makes you a little bit nervous. But we've got lots of problems with the beautiful copper sheeting on the walls, which is coming off in many places. And it's time that we need to redo it. So a month from now, we will be closing this down and redoing Rod Belt. As I say, we're going to resolve the safety concerns. We are going to increase the capacity from roughly 180, 197 to over 300. We can't totally do away with the columns, but they don't have to be that big. We don't need the platform anymore. We need to make it a much bigger open room, and we're going to do that. And going over 300, the ability to have that larger room is really needed. We're also going to be providing some conference room storage space in the structure so that things that we currently have decorating the hall will be able to be hidden when we don't need them. So as I said, we're starting about a month from now. It's going to mean that we have to close off the entrance over here that a lot of our staff do use. But by the time that we start on Rod Bell, our front entrance will be open again, so people can come back in there and get around. We've enlarged one of our conference rooms down in F193 to hold, how many, Paul? Can it hold up to 80 now, I think? And we have rooms in Keystone that can hold 80 or 90. And we are making the process of making arrangements with the RTP Foundation. They have a large auditorium. It's right at the corner of I-40 and Davis Drive, actually, and that's where council will be held. The next council meeting, we'll be holding our BSC meetings there, and we'll be holding other essentially large meetings there. Initially, we had thought we could just walk around the lake and do things at EPA, but their ability to have visitors use Wi-Fi is essentially non-existent. And there were really issues trying to be able to WebEx and so on. It just was not able to be done readily. So we think we've solved the problem. Haven't quite worked out how we're going to feed you. There's no cafeteria there. So probably expect that you'll get, a menu that you can check off and pick and pay for your lunch. And we'll do something similar with coffee, because I understand that everybody will do better if they have their coffee. So, I think we all have kind of a sense of sadness. This is such a beautiful space, and the outside of this Rod Bell is so beautiful, but it's time. So, okay. So just quickly, a couple of past events that we've had. We had this DR2 workshop in Tucson. This was really an exciting opportunity. This was Aubrey, is this our fourth one? Our fourth workshop. So we bring together, this was the first one that we really involved the medical community as well as the public health community and the environmental health community and tribal communities and academics. And we posited that there was a train derailment in downtown Tucson with, leakage of, let me see, trying to remember, was it chlorine or ammonia? Chlorine and malathion, even better, coming out of, and what we would do about it. And again, it was a pretty powerful effort. And what you learn when you do these things, it does have an impact. Aubrey's group has actually had an evaluation done of the training program that we did in Houston in 2015, which actually helped when Harvey struck. They were better prepared and able to deal with some of the issues immediately occurring from the terrible flooding there in August, September of 2017. There was a great workshop we had. Okay, I thought it was a great workshop. I actually went to it because I'm very concerned with this Mesoamerican nephropathy, which is not limited to Mesoamerica. It seems to be a problem with agricultural workers in tropical or semi-tropical, or at least hot climates in many parts of the world. This brought together, Bonnie Jalbert was on the organizing committee, as well as we had a couple of our other folks. Let's see, Ty Lawson and I think Brittany. I'm looking for Brittany. Forgetting Brittany's last name. Sorry, from our Superfund program. Were involved as well, and we had a fair number. We had Brian Berridge, Associate Director of NTP, went with me, as well as Susan Elmore and Allison Harrell and myself. And Carol Schreffler was there as well, as she has the kidney in her portfolio. But the advantage of this workshop was it brought together not only the folks who have been looking at this for maybe 10 to 20 years from Mesoamerica, but it also brought together a lot of folks from India and Sri Lanka and some other places in the world where this is occurring. I don't think we're really any clearer on what the cause is. I think the data is pretty clear that dehydration and heat progress an established lesion, but it's unlikely, at least the nephrologists are saying, dehydration doesn't cause kidney disease, but it can make it worse. So there's the folks in Sri Lanka and India think that there's a metal potentially a role for metals like arsenic or maybe some other metals in this. There are many people who think pesticides are involved, but there really is no data either way, or the data is very limited. So we're continuing to look at this issue. We hosted, there's an International Visitors Leadership Program, which basically was up at NIH and then came down here, not only in NIH, but actually in Washington, D.C., did go to NIH, about 40 international visitors who came down here to visit RTP. This fifth annual Women's Health Awareness Day is something that Joan Packingham, who's head of our Office of Human Health Research Protection, first started a number of years ago, and this is an opportunity for women in the community to come in, learn about their health, learn about how the environment may impact their health, actually get some health screening. It has grown. This is held on the grounds of North Carolina Central University. We partner with folks at Central, with a sorority at Central, and with some others to organize this. And it's grown from having maybe 150 people the first year to over 1,100 participants last April, which was pretty exciting. We kind of have outgrown our location over there. We're going to be having to look at what we can do next. PFAS and other emerging contaminants, this was one that quite a number of us attended. This was a meeting organized in Raleigh by engineers trying to, and water experts trying to really get the data out there. What is What are we looking at? How big is this problem? You know, yes, there may be 5,000 PFAS. Are they all there? How many of them are there? How can we remove PFAS? If we remove PFAS from, for example, a waste stream by certain kinds of reverse osmosis or filtration, what do you do with it? What do you do with what you got left? You know, you can go to well over 1,200 degrees centigrade, and that's what it takes to break the carbon-fluorine bond. Well, then you got lots of hydrofluoric acid, but never mind, you know, what do you do with all this stuff? So a lot of interesting questions. I think it was kind of eye-opening for the health scientists to hear some of the engineering. And what I was absolutely amazed with was how these things are everywhere. I mean, I knew they were in drinking water and sometimes groundwater, and I knew that they were in certain kinds of food containers, and I knew that they were, for example, on the carpets and the chairs and maybe on the clothes you're wearing. And I used to love spraying Scotchgard on my new tablecloth so I didn't have to worry about stains. But they are everywhere. If you're going to go out and do sampling, you can't wear your rubber boots. You can't wear regular, say, you know, gloves that you might have to do your sampling, because you can't use lots of kinds of plastic, lots of kinds of tubing, because they are everywhere. So it's a real issue. Some ways it kind of reminds me of PCBs 40 years ago, except there are a lot more PFAS than the 209 PCBs that existed. And then there was a workshop that NTP sponsored that was held actually at EPA in Washington the end of April. Converging on Cancer, which was a pretty exciting workshop trying to look for the markers of carcinogenesis. Okay, so some quick upcoming events just to mention. Okay. We've got actually tomorrow and the next day our environmental health emerging science decisions that NAEHS committee that we've been sponsoring for about 12 years now is sponsoring a workshop on artificial intelligence for environmental health research, and Rick is going to be the one to kick that off. We're heading out the environmental health core centers. We're having our annual meeting is going to be out in Iowa in a week and a half, and we're going to be doing a water quality community forum and tour as well. So I'm going to be visiting, I think, 3 farms while I'm out there. Should be kind of interesting. I'm hoping the rains will have stopped by the time we get there. I might be. Well, that would make me feel at home. Yes. Every time we have a hurricane or big water here, we have big flooding. Not so much at the Institute. We've done pretty well. But I live in Chapel Hill, and we've got several of our shopping centers that get flooded out every time. IUTOX, which is the International Union of Toxicology, is having its 15th triannual meeting, I guess, and that's going to be in Honolulu, and I guess I'm giving the keynote for that. We have CTAC is organizing a huge meeting on environmental risk assessment of PFAS, and this goes all the way from exposure to ecological to human health risks and so on. That's being held in Durham. Chris Weiss is on the organizing committee for that. There are hundreds of abstracts that have already been submitted for this. It should be a very stimulating, and we're hoping to get the feds who will be at this meeting together towards the end of it, again, to continue our federal effort in that area. The International Society for Environmental EPI is meeting in Utrecht at the very end of August. We're holding a meeting here on the fidelity of DNA replication, basic mechanism to disease at the very end of August. And then the environmental health, this new effort that we basically helped start at NAEHS is actually going to be holding a workshop on PFAS. So if you didn't know about PFAS before, you're going to certainly by the end of the summer know a lot about PFAS because there's lots of interest in it. Okay, so a couple awards and recognition. Well, I'm happy to not only talk about Sally and be sad that she's ready to retire. Actually, I'm not sad because I think it's great to move on to another stage. But she also received the Society for the Study of Reproduction Janssen Distinguished Service Award recently. And the same society gave Humphrey Yao Research Award for work that he's done over the past 6 years. And then Kembra Hattershall of DNTP received the Teratology Society New Investigator, the Clark Fraser Award, and she'll be presenting a keynote on the first day of the teratology meeting later this month. A couple of our investigators, I'm really proud of them for, what shall I say, aggressively looking for other funding opportunities. So I think we mentioned yesterday, or we heard some about the partnerships with the Office of Research on Women's Health. The Office of Research on Women's Health, the Office of Dietary Supplements, the Office of Disease Preventions. These are small offices within the greater Office of the Director. They might have $150 million. I mean, that's not so small, but they can't give grants themselves. So they partner with the institutes and centers to actually give the funding. And this year, 3 of our intramural epidemiologists were able to receive funding. Donna Baird received a nice grant to be looking at fibroids. Lexi White and Anne-Marie Juchik are both relatively new tenure tracks for us. Lexi is looking at a prospective study where she's going to be looking at toenail metals and breast cancer risk. And Anne-Marie is going to be looking at associations between chronic inflammation, fertility, and ovarian aging. And I wanted to mention 2 of our extramural grantees, Jane Hoppin. And I'm very proud. Jane is a former NIEHSer. She was in the epidemiology branch here for quite a number of years, is a North Carolina State University faculty scholar, just appointed to that. She is the PI on the time-sensitive award for looking at the PFAS contamination in Wilmington, North Carolina. Chemtura dumped Gen-X into the Cape Fear River and contaminated the municipal water supply for 300,000 people downstream. She's the PI in that, getting some very interesting data. Just for your information, you can still find, even though they've stopped the dumping of Gen-X, you can still find it in the water, in the drinking water in Wilmington, but you're not finding it in the people. But they are finding 4 previously unknown PFAS in the blood of the residents that they've looked at. So that is raising additional concern for other compounds. And Jermaine Buck-Lewis, who was a division director actually at the National Institute of Child Health and Development for many years, about 2 years ago left to be the first dean of the School of Public Health at George Mason University. And she was our choice to be the Spirit Lecture, which is an award honoring women leaders that we present every year. And she was our awardee for that. And then our WONS Awards, and I think many of you know that the WONS programs is one of my favorite programs that we have. We've got about, is it 65 or 73 alumni from the WONS program, something in that number. We usually have in the neighborhood of 60 years. Some years we've had 5, some years we've had 7. They have been incredibly successful. Many have received tenure before their WONS Awards are even up. Many of them have gone on, actually been promoted to never mind associate, but full professors even. But here are is our new group. Jessie Buckley at Johns Hopkins. She's going to be working with the HOME cohort, which is the University of Cincinnati-based birth cohort. And she's going to be looking at phthalates and PFAS and looking at development in bone. And bone health. And what I think is really interesting is she's looking in this cohort, and Abby Fleisch is going to be looking at the VIVA cohort, which is a cohort based in Boston, a pregnancy cohort. Abby is at Maine Health, and is a pediatric endocrinologist, and she's also going to be looking at bone health and adiposity. She's going to focus more on adolescence, and she's focusing more on early childhood issues. John Gaffin is at Boston Children's and as a pediatrician, and he's going to be looking at different indoor air components and The cohort of children he's working with are kids who were born premature and have bronchopulmonary dysplasia, so that they have respiratory issues, and trying to understand what it is in indoor air that aggravates or what you can do to prevent problems with the breathing of these kids. Aishwar Prakash is looking at mitochondrial damage and how oxidative stress can impact mitochondria. She's doing a structural analysis involving lots of different types of X-ray crystallography to understand the mechanisms ongoing here. Yogesh Saini is looking at myeloid cells in the role of myeloid cells in ozone-induced airway disease. Actually, there's a specific type of myeloid cells that are involved. And Christina Whitworth at the UT School of Public Health is looking at neurodevelopment and looking at, let's see, make sure I get that one right. She's focusing on fetal growth and neurodevelopment, and focusing on what are trying to define more closely the critical windows of susceptibility. There's lots of data showing that neurodevelopment is sensitive, but trying to understand first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, infancy, childhood, what are really the critical windows, and they may not be the same for different kinds of toxicants, and she's going to be looking at a number. So I think that gives you kind of an overview of some of the exciting stuff that's going on, and happy to answer any questions. No questions? Okay, well then we'll go on to the next.
Okay, so the next three speakers we're going to have will be different concept clearances for either continuation or new programs. As we discussed yesterday, we're bringing them to your attention, and each one of these have reviewers, and then we'll do a vote for each of the concept clearances. The first one will be about our time-sensitive program, and Martha Barnes, who has been the coordinator of that program for many years, will present the next. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Martha, but I just have to, I was so embarrassed. Brittany Trottier. Couldn't remember, all of a sudden your last name escaped me.
No problem. Gives me a chance to get more nervous up here. Okay, so good morning. I'm here to present the concept for the renewal of the NAEHS time-sensitive program. I will say I'm losing my voice. I am not unhappy that this building is being revised because I'm really allergic to this space. The talk will include the background, analysis of the time-sensitive program, and the future.
Martha, can you move the microphone a little closer to your mouth? Because the people on the WebEx are going to have trouble hearing. Or just move closer where you're standing.
Okay. Excuse me. Is that better? Okay. So first up is the background. The time-sensitive FOAs have been used at NIH since 2001. They're intended to support research in which the opportunity is fleeting, so funding requires a shorter time frame than the usual NIH process, which is actually 8 to 12 months. And the mechanism is used by several institutes. Each program is unique to the institute. At the time of major events such as the World Trade Center disaster and Hurricane Katrina, the only way NIEHS could fund time-sensitive research was through administrative supplements, which are limited to current grantees, and they're not peer-reviewed, and so the process is inclusive. We needed a better, fair system. So we began the time-sensitive program, which is intended to support research in environmental health science in which an event has or will imminently occur, that provides a limited window of opportunity to collect samples and data to support the assessment of exposures and human health impact. The goal is to provide data that will facilitate timely action to protect health. The NAEHS program has been a model for the time-sensitive programs, and other ICs have consulted with us in development of their programs. So the distinguishing characteristics of an eligible study are the unforeseeable nature of the opportunity and the need for rapid review and funding. Approaches include the characterization of initial exposures, collection of human biological samples, collection of human health and exposure data. We encourage partnerships between researchers in the affected community and the leveraging of existing cohorts whenever possible. So the NIEHS time-sensitive program began in 2007 with a joint initiative with NIDA. In 2010, we released a pair of program announcements that used the R03, which is a small grant mechanism, and the R21, which is a high-reward, high-risk mechanism. The R03 wasn't a good fit for the program, so we reissued only the R21 in 2013. And in response to an NIH enforcement of a policy that disallowed withdrawal of non-responsive applications to program announcements, in 2016 we changed and issued the program as an RFA. Additionally, for major disasters such as Superstorm Sandy, where we get lots of applications, we have issued guide notices that announce a set number of receipt dates through which we will receive the applications. So we continue to use the R21 mechanism. PIs may request a maximum of $275,000 in direct costs over 2 years, with no more than $200,000 in any given year. We request letters of intent when we issued them through the RFA to allow staff to consider responsiveness. We have 12 receipt dates per year. They occur around the first of every month, depending on when holidays and weekends fall. That's something here. I seem to be lost here. What did I do? So we use a team approach to management. The team is comprised of a program coordinator, the time-sensitive committee, which includes a program officer from each program branch, a representative from core staff, and the deputy director of DERT, as well as the scientific review officer and the grants management specialist. Upon submission, applications are assigned to the appropriate program officer based on the science. So here is the average timeline in weeks. We request an LOI 30 days prior to application submission. And upon receipt, the LOI is sent to the committee to determine responsiveness. Applications are due around the first of the month, and applications submitted without an LOI undergo the same administrative review for responsiveness as those that are submitted with an LOI. The review meeting is generally held within 6 weeks of application submission, and summary statements are released within a week of the review. Depending on timing, applications go to early or regular council concurrence. And while they're undergoing council concurrence, at the same time, staff is meeting with the deputy director to formulate the funding plan. Once we have concurrence, the funding plan is sent forward for approval, and once approved, the award process begins. And overall, that takes about 4 months. So in preparation for the reannouncement of the program, early in fiscal 2018, Dr. Steve Toyoshimi from the Program Analysis Branch undertook an analysis of the program. For today's presentation, Steve was kind enough to update the program through 2019 February Council. So while the analysis was comprehensive, due to time constraints, I'll be discussing only the portfolio characterization and the benefits of the time-sensitive program. This chart breaks out the total number of applications received for each funding opportunity announcement by the application status. Applications are withdrawn by CSR for technical reasons or by NAEHS as non-responsive. And for those that are sent forward to review, applications are shown as not discussed, not awarded, or awarded. The total success rate, which is the total number of applications awarded out of the total applications reviewed, is shown at the top of each of the columns. PAR 10-084 includes both the Gulf oil spill and Superstorm Sandy. PAR 13-136 was the calm before the storm. That only event that was had multiple applications was the Flint water crisis. The past 2 years have seen several hurricanes and wildfires. And as you can see, in these 2 years, we've received almost as many applications and have funded more applications than the 2 previous PARs combined. So displayed here are the reviewed applications broken out by the type of event. These include both U.S. and global events, such as the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan and mycotoxins in Guatemala. While we receive applications on a broad range of topics, the greatest number by far are the hurricanes. So the time-sensitive program is predicated on the need for rapid review and funding in order for the scientific question to be approached and the research design to be implemented. This slide displays the time from receipt to award for the 32 awarded applications. You can see the average time to award for the time-sensitive grant is essentially 115 days, or approximately 3.8 months. In comparison, Steve looked at unsolicited R21s that have come in without an amended application, and these were from fiscal year 2015. The average time from receipt to award, shown by the dotted blue line, was just under 312 days, which is approximately 10.25 months. So under the time-sensitive program, we issue awards on average over 6 months faster. So time-sensitive applications should demonstrate clear scientific value and feasibility that help provide information necessary for rapid translation into public health action. The next few slides show results from 4 time-sensitive awards issued under the first 2 PARs. The first awards from the RFA weren't made until early in fiscal year 2017, and as the projects are not yet completed, we haven't analyzed them for outcomes, but we'll do that in the future. So Kim Anderson's team deployed passive samplers to assess the fate and bioavailability of both oxygenated and unoxygenated polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in the air and water within the Gulf of Mexico following the Deepwater Horizon spill. They provided animated educational videos about potential routes of PAH exposure related to the spill, and she has published several papers, including the high-impact papers cited here. This is an example of a non-disaster related time-sensitive grant that was a collaborative project between Dr. Hernandez at Columbia University and WE ACT, which stands for West Harlem Environmental Action, a community-based organization in Manhattan. The project looked at the effect of a policy change in New York City that aimed to reduce black carbon emissions by requiring buildings to convert from burning number 6 oil to cleaner fuel types. They recruited owners, managers, and residents of buildings that were converting to number 4 or 2 oil or natural gas, and sampled indoor and outdoor levels of black carbon pre- and post-conversion. They also conducted in-depth interviews with policymakers and advocacy groups, as well as the building owners, managers, and residents, to evaluate the factors involved in the passage of the law and challenges in implementation. And they published an article in Cityscape, which is a New York magazine. Sean McElmurray and his research team examined the Flint drinking water crisis. The crisis was precipitated when the city of Flint switched water sources from the city of Detroit, which draws water from deep within Lake Huron, to the water from the Flint River. Improper treatment of the river water caused lead to leach out of old pipes, resulting in increased blood lead levels in the children. The study collected water samples from homes of children with high blood levels before and after pipes were removed. They modeled the Flint water system and combined it with over 21,000 geo-referenced and time-stamped children's blood levels. And they estimated the social cost based on earnings lost due to increase in water lead exposed children to $65 million, in contrast with an estimated $2 million savings from switching the water source. This study led to 2 papers, Flint Water Crisis, evidence from blood lead levels in children, and the crisis, what happened and why. And final one is from Paloma Beamer and Carlotta Chief, whose project investigated the short-term exposure and risk to members of the Navajo Nation following the Gold King mine spill. An estimated 3 million gallons of acid water and metals spilled from the mine into Colorado's Animas River, and from there it flowed into the San Juan River, which is the primary source of irrigation for the Navajo Nation farmers. And in the photo, you can see the resulting color of the Animas River. The project included collection of soil, sediment, and water sampling and analysis, identification of activities and ways community members interact with the river, and listening sessions to hear community concerns. Updates of the study were provided to the communities, and an editorial on how the disaster affected the nation was published in Truth Out. So ideally, projects funded through the time-sensitive program will provide data that leads to analysis of longer-term health incomes. And here are two examples where this can be seen. First, through the 2011 time-sensitive award related to the Gulf oil spill, Edward Trapito and his team developed the procedures and infrastructure for a larger cohort study that examined the health of women and their children in southeast Louisiana. And second, Adam Gonzalez Award in 2013 looked at the effects of Hurricane Sandy on the respiratory and mental health of World Trade Center responders. That project led to a clinical trial to adapt and test the efficacy of the NAEHS disaster resilience worker training materials for Sandy responders. And that trial can be found on clinicaltrials.gov at the NCT number listed here. So in summary, time-sensitive applications are funded considerably faster than through the regular receipt referral process. The research has resulted in some important findings, and we see connections between time-sensitive grants and longer-term research projects. So where do we go from here? The last receipt date of the current RFA is September 2nd of this year. If we reissue the RFA in late summer, we will avoid a break in continuity between the two RFAs. And while it will remain mostly the same, we are proposing to make some changes. So in the guide notice, we've included language on research topics supported through the Superfund research program. In the next RFA, Superfund will become a part of the program. Applications would be submitted to the RFA, and projects will be funded from either the regular time-sensitive funds or Superfund program funds, depending on the science. We're considering changes to the eligibility of foreign institutions. We have changed the initiatives back and forth. It's been issued both with and without foreign institution eligible. We're still discussing that. We're well aware that there are some additional hurdles to jump through for international institutions, but we also know that not all domestic grants get funded within a really short period of time. Sometimes there are circumstances that cause those to be longer, so we're still discussing that. And then we do plan to strengthen the language in the RFA to emphasize uniqueness and importance of the proposed research. So I'd like to acknowledge the staff who've contributed to the program over the past 10 years. This is not an exhaustive list with monthly receipt dates. This is a labor-intensive program, and it takes a village to make it work. So most every scientific review officer, program officer, and grants management specialist has worked on a review or grant awarded through the program. And I'd like to thank you for your attention and ask if you have any questions. And with no questions, I will turn this over to council reviewers, Dr. Jose Cordero and Edith Parker. I don't know if you've decided who's talking first, so go ahead.
This is a very important program, and having lived through Hurricane Maria and the impact it had in Puerto Rico, can say that there were so many things that changed, and it really has been an opportunity to obtain important data, like our colleague Ingrid Padilla had been able to do because of being out there like 3 days after the hurricane. The ability to do to make proposals, put a letter of intent, and making it a very short period to go from proposal to approval and funding. It is very important, and I think you gave some very good examples of other projects that actually have yield very important data. So this is very important, and certainly highly we support it very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Jose. I think this is a wonderful program, and I've been really impressed with the timeline, and the facility of that. I think I like the addition of the Superfund interest. I think is a plus. I think just one question, and I think the 4.5 months or 133 days is great, but it still would be great if we could make it even shorter on that. But in talking with Martha, it seems like there are some constraints around that, and I want to acknowledge we are currently, with internal funding, trying to get together some research on our flooding, and it's taken us 6 weeks without any external review and with the IRB in place to get it on the ground. So I do realize how tough that can be. So I'm very supportive. And also, just one other thing, I really like the flexibility, such as including policy research on implementation of a new policy, because I think that's going to be important as we move forward. So great job.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Maureen.
Thank you very much.
Martha,
Oh, wait, Martha.
Martha,
Got
thank
some
you
questions.
for highlighting a very needed program. I live in an area where disasters occur all the time,
Right.
and this has been very helpful in getting us as quick as possible, I suppose, in the field. What I want to bring up, and I know that you mentioned that you're just still discussing it, but disasters, like so many other things, know no borders. And there are hurricanes that affect both U.S. territory, but also the same hurricane affects some other areas that are outside of the U.S. So taking that into consideration and looking at and be able to compare whether it's issues of policy or outcomes, but using the effects or as a consequence of the effect of the same hurricane in two countries actually will be advancing the research. And so as you're deliberating, I'm just sharing that perspective.
Okay.
Edith.
Yeah, just one thing I meant to ask a question is opportunities for sharing across agencies, sort of like in disasters. I was thinking MIMH, would they ever be interested if you were doing a research post-disaster, because so much of it is the mental health consequences? Is that?
Sure. I mean, we've seen that some of the other ICs have developed their own rapid programs around, like Zika was an example where I think 9 or 10 ICs wanted to participate in getting these kinds of facilitation and feasibility and moving science more quickly. There was after we did our notice around the hurricanes, NIMHD also put out one specifically about Puerto Rico. So, sometimes we're amazingly coordinated. Sometimes there's room for improvement there. But we've had conversations back and forth with the different institutes, and for each time another activity comes up, we decide whether we should join somebody else's or invite another institute into our notice around the topic. So we're working on that all the time.
Okay.
Jose,
Yes.
you had a question here, and then we'll go over here.
Okay.
Well, actually, my question was related to what you just mentioned, because you talked before, you said that each institute that has the time-sensitive program, the mechanism is really unique to
The programs
the
are
IC, and the
different.
question, how different what we do are compared to other ICs
Yeah, so again,
in
each
terms of timing and
Right. So, certainly they're in their mission area, and the science that they're looking for may be quite different than the science that we're looking for. Some of the programs are not necessarily, policy-related things. Like, we have a very broad distribution In terms of timing, I know that when some of the other ICs have created theirs, they've come to us to see how we've gotten it done so quickly. And sometimes it matches exactly what we've done, or sometimes it, is slightly different. So I think the key is that when an IC decides to have a program like this, the extramural community has to read that announcement really carefully and not assume that the programs have all of the same eligibility requirements or process. Marla.
Yes?
Marla.
I have a
and then Lynn.
curiosity. I have done some analysis on the patterns of awarding quick response research in other funding agencies, and I have noted a negative bias towards the local university. Have you seen what if there's patterns emerging in the application process where local universities are favored, or are there any initiative to build capacity in local institutions for them to be able to be the initiators of research, not outsiders?
So we have not done any program to build capacity for time-sensitive specific. We have other programs that build capacity for research between communities and universities and things. I've not seen a negative bias at all. We've accepted applications from around the world, and the majority of them are domestic or domestic with foreign components. But they're all treated the same, and we take the best applications regardless of where they're located and have funded those.
Yeah, so I would just want to add that through our disaster response research program, we've really built a lot of capacity within our grantee community using our P30 core centers, our Superfund centers, all of our programs. And in the Hurricane Harvey situation, a majority of those awards were made to local universities that were in the path of the hurricane and had the best opportunity to do that. But we don't limit these grants to the local.
Right.
We do allow other subject matter experts to partner, and we do encourage community engagement with the local communities so that the research can be implemented appropriately.
And so the example I gave from Dr. Anderson, she's at Oregon University, and yet the work that she was doing was down in Louisiana. So we get things from all over.
Yeah, so just to follow, alluding to Martha's comment about the difficulty of getting these out, one of the things we've had to deal with is that there's a very quick turnaround for the applicant to put it in, and so sometimes the application is not written great. Yeah, and I think the larger universities maybe have a better infrastructure to do that. They're more used to turning these things around quickly. We've tried to do things like allow applicants to come back in with like a response to the review and whatever to try to mitigate that a little bit, but it is a tricky kind of question. Yeah.
Lynn, do you want to add something?
Yeah, first and foremost, I think it's such a great program, and I'm glad that you're going to continue it. And I don't have a vote at this meeting, but I certainly would vote for it if I did. But one thing that occurs to me, a couple things, and one is that I'm sure just through doing this, that you're discovering ways in general to do R21s more efficiently, and that, the process of being under pressure to turn these around more quickly, perhaps you're finding ways that, that there's steps that could be cut out, so that's something to consider, in general. And I'm pretty sure, as Ruth said, that, you could probably bring it down by a week or two still, but I don't know how much bang you get for the buck for that. I mean, what we really want is to be able to get out there right away, sometimes to be able to collect samples and be engaged with study subjects, and that's just so difficult, even if we have internal resources in our organizations for doing that. But I did have another idea, which is completely outside the box. So I just wanted to say it, and that is that, maybe it's possible to come up with a completely different mechanism that would allow for the peer review and identification of potential grantees to do this kind of responsive research before their disasters, and then allow people to come in basically with task statements, where they've been pre-reviewed, their methodology have been pre-reviewed, and have task statements. When you mentioned Zika virus, Linda, one of the things that occurred to me is that I and several of my colleagues really were interested when we started spraying pesticides in Florida to be able to go out and monitor and be able to be engaged with that. But by the time we would have gotten through a 100-day thing, that sprain would have ended. You know, it wouldn't have been possible. And if there were some way to pre-position resources without funding, but to just pre-position approvals and, you know, that we put it through, it had been reviewed, we could be ready to hit the ground with something like that. I'm pretty sure you can do that probably with some of your existing centers, but that would open up the possibility for others to get engaged as well, including people in local communities.
Thanks for that idea. One other thing I just wanted to mention too is that the Office of Extramural Research created a mechanism to fast track administrative supplements around these public health, to do it in a way that was less biased and, you know, more transparent. So, you know, for each of these episodes, we learn something new, but I like this idea. We'll think about it again, Linda, and then
I
Jan.
just want to make a point that these time-sensitive awards are not just for disasters.
Right.
No,
They
that's
can
true.
also- They can, you know, and Martha gave an example of one where there was a change in regulation and led, you know, and you wanted to take advantage of the before and after. So it's not just disaster.
Jan?
Yes, I just wanted to remind council of something that I believe that we've talked about before relating to the DR2 program. And part of the intramural contribution to the DR2 program has actually been working with the regulatory aspects of getting out there into the field sooner rather than later. And that has really been growing with more codification of the kinds of issues that need to be considered. And also, we have recently begun some training exercises. One of them was done in Arizona along with Aubrey's program, and there was another one done here recently in terms of training IRBs in terms of what to look for. And then, of course, the DR2 program also has a lot of resources for questionnaires and things like that that are on the website that's coordinated through NON that can also be brought to bear. But I think the IRB piece is heating up a little bit, and you should be hearing a little bit more about that coming in the next 6 months or so, I hope, particularly in terms of kind of a package, a template, kind of instructions for IRBs in terms of how to review. So,
Brad, and then Katrina.
So building on that, so one way to accelerate this would be to do what's being done in the clinical trials world. So if I'm doing a clinical trial at WashU and I have to use my IRB, it's 3-6 months to get it approved, but I can get approval through a central IRB in a week. So that the central, NIH forcing central IRBs could make a dramatic difference. I mean, these are months differences in approvals when you can use a centralized IRB.
Yeah, I think Jan was alluding to that, and she'll add something.
I am to a point, but there's also issues of the special circumstances for people that are either working in a disaster area or part of a disaster. And although you can get quick approvals sometimes, they may not be informed approvals. And so we need to kind of balance those things, because you can think about not everybody, but you need to consider whether these are vulnerable people. And so I think those issues are things to think about ahead of time and make sure that you've addressed it and thought about it in the ways that you approach the science.
On this side, Katrina?
So, being from Rochester, where, knock wood, we don't have hurricanes or wildfires, I'm particularly interested in the non-disaster related components of this mechanism. And as Linda said, there are lots of things that we do that cause time-sensitive opportunities, and they can be public, like public policy change, or private actions. I remember, to your example, when hydrofracking was expanding into our area, thinking this is an entirely predictable disaster, both in terms of occupational health and combined with flooding. And if we could be set up to capture when that does happen, because we know it's going to, we'd be in much better circumstances. But I just have a couple of language suggestions that I think could really emphasize that, because this has been so well recognized in terms of the great work it's done in disaster response. So the goal says that it's its goal is to understand the consequences of natural and man-made disasters or emergency public health threats. But then when you read farther, it calls out policy changes affecting air and water. There's some way to work the idea of policy and practice changes into that overall goal. I think it would help reinforce that. And until 2 or so years ago, I think most environmental policy changes I could think of would be expected to have the effect of improving environmental quality and reducing threats. Therefore, in our change times, I encourage you to add the phrase environmental change to environmental threats so that we could capture policy changes that might have negative effects as well. And perhaps ironically, because of that, there's a plethora of state level policies that are brewing that are wending their way through state legislators right now that could create some really interesting time-sensitive opportunities to observe and compare the environmental and potentially health effects of some of these unexpected policy changes. And here, again, coming from New York, we are likely to be about to ban chlorpyrifos and PFAS in firefighting foam, and it would really hurt me if we couldn't watch the effects of that and learn from that for other states. Similarly, there may be private initiatives like the example of hydrofracking that can happen really quickly and unexpectedly. So studying the effects of these policy or industrial practices could be really essential for informing policy changes elsewhere and potentially at the policy level, at the federal level. So also, many of these changes that I mentioned refer to consumer products or things that aren't necessarily going to affect air and water quality. So just broadening that language of effects on air and water quality to environmental exposures, I think would also open the floor for some of these
we
other
can certainly
kinds of
discuss all of that.
Yeah, those are great ideas. Thank you. I think we intended many years ago to have the broadest program possible, but the circumstances of what happened in the workforce interest has really, sort of changed the focus of the program. So I've always thought about how can we broaden it back up. So that's really helpful. All right, any other comments or questions? If not, we need a vote to approve this concept. Okay, and second, thank you. Okay, hand vote this time, so all in favor? Liz is counting. Okay, any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Martha.
Thank you very much.
All right, we have a break here, and we actually need to take this break longer than it says because Christine would like us to keep this at the exact same time. Yeah, so we're going to take a longer break than we might have, and we'll come back and we'll do the next concept clearance at 10:30.
It's always a little bit hard to come back from a long break, but I think we are in for a very important discussion that will be led by Kim Gray.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. So my name is Kimberly Gray, and for those of you who are new to council or in the audience, I'm an epidemiologist in the population health branch. I was here last council giving you an update on children's environmental health, and today, after that discussion we had with council and within our institution, I'm going to present a translational lens for children's and environmental health, a new vision here at NAEHS for 2020. So the mission, I don't think anyone mentioned this today, so I'm just going to remind everybody what the mission of the National Institute of Environmental Health Science is. It's to discover how the environment affects people in order to promote healthier and happier lives. In the area of children's environmental health, NIEHS supports a number of local and international research projects that examine a lot of pollutants, from air pollution to metals to pesticides to halogenated compounds. I'm going to show you here in the next few slides NIEHS' extensive research program in children's environmental health and how that program, along with a lot of our other programs, have really increased our understanding of the unique vulnerability of our children to these harmful environmental agents, and really how it's helping us guide the development of protective measures for children, not only in the U.S., but internationally and globally. So why are we still studying children's environmental health? Well, we know the children still are not as healthy as they should be. I shared this with you last council, but we even have some updates. So during 2014 to 16, the prevalence of children with developmental disabilities increased from 5.7% to 6.99%. The prevalence of children ever diagnosed with a developmental delay or other than autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability also increased from 3.5 in 2014 to 4.5 in 2016. Over 10 million of our U.S. children under the age of 18, that's about 14%, have ever been diagnosed with asthma, and 10% still have been diagnosed with asthma. 1 in 5 children in the U.S. And adolescents are classified as obese, with significant increases in obesity and severe obesity in children ages 2 to 5 from the years 2015 and 16. And the WHO still reports that half of our children are allergic to something. So what is the cost of this burden on our children? Well, the impact on society is great. $76 billion in annual cost of environmentally related diseases to children in the United States. We have over $2.2 billion annual cost of childhood asthma treatment attributed to environmental factors, and the others are related to IQ, $11,000 to $15,000 lifetime earnings loss as a result of loss of just one IQ point, and over $1.4 to $2.4 million spent in lifetime cost of supporting one child with autism. Since the inception of our Children's Centers program, our researchers, supported by NAEHS and EPA, have really laid the strong foundation for a new way of thinking about children's environmental health and the environment. At the same time, NAEHS developed a sustained, strong base of children's environmental health research projects and infrastructure support through other mechanisms. I'm going to remind you of what I presented in February Council and also show you some more slides on our total investment over time. So, children's environmental health funding over time at NIEHS, we have a grand total of over $1 billion and over 1,150 projects. To come up with these numbers, we are using the research, condition, and disease categorization, which shows that we have about 1,100 unique children's environmental health projects received funding between 2008 to 2018, with about 1,100 projects. In 2018 alone, we have $100 million supported in children's environmental health, and 335 of those are research. Those are projects within research grants. And our funding across the United States currently at 2018 is allocated studying children's environmental health across the United States. You can see we still maintain some gaps in those areas, and that funding of $100 million has a wide range from the lowest funding at $72,000 in South Carolina to our largest in California at $18.9 million. The science we support here at NIEHS varies by funding type, science, health outcomes, and exposures. Again, the funding type is we kind of call unsolicited and solicited. So 55% of our current funding is unsolicited. That is where the researchers themselves and their institution come up with the ideas and submit and go through our peer review at Center for Scientific Review. 44% is solicited, and a majority of that would be peer reviewed here at NIEHS. Majority of our science supported by NIEHS is in epidemiology or clinical, and we support a broad array of health outcomes, predominantly neurological, cognitive outcomes. This includes behavior, temperament, as well as IQ. We see an uptick in metabolic outcomes and birth outcomes, and we still continue to look at reproductive and respiratory outcomes. Exposures of interest that are being looked at within our portfolio continues to be air pollutants, which are either PM, traffic pollutants, also using land use regression models to estimate exposure. We have a large metals portfolio as well as mixtures, meaning more than one pollutant. And just to scroll down a little bit, you'll see that our chlorinated, brominated, and fluorinated compounds are about 12 to 9% of that current portfolio. Our portfolio varies by mechanism. I bring this up because I wanted to let you know where the majority of our science is funded. You can see in the R01 which is kind of the bread and butter of NIH. The majority of our research is in the R's, which is R01, R21, and R03s. Those are kind of the unsolicited, and that's about $78 million. But again, the majority is coming from our R01, which is $62 million. And these are the kind of grants that young investigators and senior investigators need to maintain a real robust research program as well as to obtain tenure. NIEHS, along with NIH, has ongoing children's environmental health research programs today. Those include maintain and enrich resource infrastructure for existing environmental EPI cohorts. That's an RFA that was developed about 2 years ago, and it continues. The purpose of this funding opportunity was really to solicit applications to support the maintenance of our environmentally enriched cohorts and community outreach efforts, as well as enrich the research infrastructure to improve scientific activities to facilitate broad data sharing. A lot of these applications that were funded over 2 years ago are really working to clean up their data dictionaries and to really provide the support to their interviewers and assessors to keep in touch with their participants and keep them engaged, as well as reporting back some individual reports. NIEHS also has established the infrastructure for human health exposures analysis and resource, also known as HERE, formerly known as CHEER. As you know, the goal of this consortium is to provide the research community access to laboratory and statistical analysis to add or expand the inclusion of environmental exposures. And we continue to support the Virtual Consortium for Translational Transdisciplinary Environmental Research. That program is to really bring together interdisciplinary scientists from within their institution if they've never worked together to partner. It's about 3 years. We have $2.5 million commitment for that. And that's now an R01, where before it was a revision to an existing grant. So that's open to keep the interdisciplinary science robust. And then NIHS partners with NIH, as Linda alluded to, in managing the environmental influences on child health outcomes. This program itself has really was dovetailed on the National Children's Study. It has over 70 extant birth cohorts. They're collecting data and maintaining a protocol amongst those cohorts. As we know, many of the members in our council are active participants of this program, where they're looking at environmental exposures in a larger societal sense of from environment to behavioral to social issues that influence pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes of those children. CHEER, now known as HERE, is a member of ECHO and provides that environmental exposures and some statistical support to that program. And of the observational studies that are part of ECHO, there's 70. NIEHS leads this representation of cohort sites with over 20. And as Linda alluded to before, some of our members of council and members of our birth cohorts lead some of those working groups within ECHO. ECHO has it's a very interesting program that already has papers coming out of it before the protocols have been developed through some collective analysis. And the outcomes of interest are upper and lower respiratory, obesity, birth outcomes, neurodevelopment, and now they've added a new one, positive health. So then a strong program for us to continue to look at environment and children's health. So I've showed you about over $100 million currently and supported by NIEHS and Children's Environmental Health. And we've used this slide before, but the latest research shows that we need to do something with this research. So I have shown you in the past what the children's centers have been able to do with the 20 years of research under that program. EPA, along with NIEHS, published the Children's Impact Report. The children's centers put this report together and contributed their science, their health outcomes, their environmental exposure data, as well as their vignettes from their community outreach and actions. And it really was a overwhelming response from the community about how our science really impacted not only at the local level, but at the national policy level. And it provides a very good overview of the center's impact in science and health. In 2018, we hosted a meeting here at NAEHS to really, and we tasked the children's centers with really talking about the visibility of the science using the translational research framework that was recently published by Christy Pettibone and Christy Drew and others in July of that year. And the centers were really tasked with how to raise the visibility of science through that transitional lens, going from the fundamental questions to the practice and impacts at the national and regional level. The centers have showed that the results and resources can be shared. And what we did learn from a side discussion panel with our pediatricians from our PASHUs were that the clinical awareness was still needed, even within the PASHUs themselves. And then follow that up, we found out that social media has now become an incredibly valuable tool for the children's centers and those outreach translation centers to translate the research results coming from those centers. So where should NAEHS go with all of the science for the past 10 years and currently that's outside of the center's program? How do we offer the discoveries of this science that is met with such great interest from our stakeholders, such as healthcare professionals, community-based organizations, yet still not embraced with the mainstream practice? So we thought it was time, seeing the successes that we had from the center's program, to develop a program that was really broader and to move the science from the shelf to the real-world impacts that can improve children's health. So I just want to remind everybody what we're talking about here is our basic science includes epidemiology, is kind of working in this internal circle of fundamental questions. And what we're now looking at is how can we give other opportunities to the broader research program to really start working in these other circles, especially in application synthesis, implication and adjustment. This is where some of the tool testing is going in a controlled setting, and this is where we're doing some adjustment on some messaging and as well as some pilot testing on some research projects to really move it out into practice and impact, not only within a center's program, but for the broader portfolio. So what we've come up with is capitalizing on this strong base is the idea that giving our active research an opportunity to really control the message, to take their research and translate the results. So we want to provide a collaborative space for a network of children's environmental health investigators at large to exchange science, approaches, and tools used in research, as well as in research dissemination. So now this is really going to include a larger focus now on health communication expertise, which will be an essential part of this program. We want to prioritize and share not only the scientific knowledge and tangible tools and methods, but we want to develop those best practices for children's environmental health, translating the general ideas, which could be for future research proposals, collaborative projects on messaging. It could be communications research, with the really idea of raising awareness and impact of our science that we've supported for over these years in clinical and public health practice. And we hope that it would serve as a national resource, not only to the children's environmental health community, but also to any emerging threat in the nation, as well as generate new ideas and test pilot projects to get them prepared for research, whether it's children's environmental health or communication research. So the purpose of these translational centers is to continue and facilitate that interaction not only between the children's environmental health investigators, but the communications researchers, to engage our stakeholders and continue to move the science and push it into public health and clinical practice, to synthesize and translate the larger body of children's environmental health research, to stimulate pilot projects, as well as to test new tools, methods, interventions, and prevention strategies. Who would be encouraged and eligible to apply? Well, we think this really requires a multiple PI approach. So you'll have the very established children's environmental health investigator with a very well-established health risk communication expert. One of the requirements that we see would probably be fundamentally required would be a really strong base of subject matter experts in children's environmental health. That would be a collective history of funded research, most recently, as well as a robust publication history in children's environmental health, so they have a base of knowledge in which to translate. We want evidence of working with key stakeholders, however they define them, as well as we really are looking at this to be not within institution, but a collaboration outside the institution with children's environmental researchers from across the region or across the nation. We look at the center structure and function as having some major components. You may have seen in your slide set they were described as cores. We've discussed how to pull back from that kind of model and really talk about this as a component, and you would see these as individual projects. The administrative component is still really required for the overall leadership and organization of the framework, which would divide and manage the resources amongst the components and oversee the program and direction. The developmental core, which would foster and manage a pilot project program, which is testing or evaluation of communication and message strategies, as well as provide professional development and career advancement for the next generation of children's environmental health scientists. The larger component, which is translation or research translation component, would really be focusing on that curriculum development of short courses for pediatricians, for OBGYNs, for internists, the messaging, both at the community level, at the public health level, and some of those really dissemination efforts through social media, as well as develop and implement a really cohesive dissemination strategy for those target audiences. This is kind of a visual. I don't really want to take up much of your time to get bogged down in this, and we see this as can be different sizes. It's not a one size fits all. That's why we have the shaded lines here, but this base of children's environmental health and communication knowledge base will be the core structure of the center program. What keeps these scientists and subject matter expertise kind of engaged would be the use of the developmental core for pilot project and testing of their materials. And then this translational component I could see probably being more managed by the social scientists and the communications researchers, where they're really doing some other types of products, give you a few ideas. The developmental core, this is the mentored collaborative space where there's opportunities for mentoring, there's opportunities for pilot projects. We see this as being the inner ring of the translational framework, including implementation and adjustment, application and synthesis, where the research would be synthesized and priorities would be set. These are a few examples of some of the ideas that could be going on within that developmental core. The translational component, if there's a lot of existing data, the synthesis has already been conducted, more activity could be going on in the translation component, moving that science into practice and impact. We see this focused really on the materials, the curriculum development, the dissemination and messaging, including personalized individual reporting back of research results to your community members and participants. Here are some of the impacts we would like to see at the policy, clinical practice, public health practice, also potentially at the behavioral change, which kind of goes back to the developmental component where you could start doing some pilot on some intervention strategies. So this is the program as it's seen today with multiple components going from the inner core to the components of the application synthesis practice, adjustment and impact, where we really just want to try to move that base science outside of research results and just publications. So when we started talking about this back in the fall, we really kind of dovetailed this with kind of the disaster response and how could we be a beacon for others to see us as having a national or regional representation where people could go, stakeholders could go and have trusted information on children's environmental health research. I've always thought about the lighthouse. And that's kind of our idea and sentiment to this new program, the new lens to the children's environmental health with more emphasis on research translation, but again, still a fruitful network and collaborative space for research ideas to be generated and piloted. We were really having some difficult times trying to decide on a mechanism. So this is just an idea of what we're thinking about in the scope. We're requesting an RFA because this is children's environmental health, and it's a large commitment from NAEHS. It's $5 million. We're proposing a P2C mechanism or a U2C mechanism. For those of you who are not familiar with the mechanisms, the U2C is, I think, what they use for here. So it's a resource mechanism. The P2C would be used if it was really more guided by the investigator and which would be the collaboration between the children's environmental health expert as well as the communications expert. The U would give us more leverage and collaborating and integrating the centers across the awardees. We expect to fund about 5 awards, start at about a $750,000 package direct cost. This is a very nimble program, but I think there's a lot that can be done with $750,000, especially starting with, I don't want to say the low-hanging fruit, but where we see a lot of the science and epidemiology and neuro and some of our exposures such as air pollution and metals. Maximum project period would be 5 years. We have discussed a way of managing the program and coordination is that where a U or a P mechanism would be needed is we would work with the centers to increase collaboration. Some of them will probably be doing the same type of research synthesis, share best practices on how to communicate different stakeholders and coordinate those translational efforts so they're not stepping over each other and really sharing best practices. We will develop and maintain a federal working group for coordination. As we told you, ECHO is one of the leading programs in children's health, which has over 70 cohorts. They would be vital for us to be sharing what we're doing and be an integrated partner here. Continue our partnership with EPA and the Office of Children's Health would be an integral part of this management. We would continue grantee meetings with our federal partners. Invite ATSDR as well and our CDC partners and our HHS agencies so they can really share the science, share the translational efforts and the products that are developed from these centers. We will always work with our federal partners as we do now, but maybe more in being prepared and to respond to regional and national and global children's environmental health issues. The timeline of this, although it may seem quick, we've been thinking about this for some time, is present to you and get your feedback, any changes that may be needed. Hopefully, it would be nice if we could have this published for Children's Environmental Health Day or for that month. That's kind of ambitious, but it would be nice to have something like that for us to broadcast and publicize. If that would be the date, then spring would be probably the date of receipt. Our scientific review panel, always convened by NAEHS, by Linda Bass, would be summer of 2020. I'll be back in the fall of 2019, hopefully, to present a program plan to council. And the earliest start date for those centers would be winter of 2020. I have to make a few acknowledgments here. Besides all the PIs who work on all these projects and this $100 million investment in 2018 and their participants and the moms and the offspring and the fathers, I couldn't create this concept, which is really near and dear to our hearts without Liam O'Fallon. Half of this language I don't know how to use. This is not in my vernacular. So I've got a learning curve here. So he'll be supporting me as he has. We worked together on the Children's Centers program in the past. Claudia Thompson, who is our branch chief, who just knows how to make everything look pretty and sound a lot better than it really is. And then Barbara Gittleman. Barbara has been my grants management specialist and has walked me through some really difficult times managing some of you PIs and has really been important and critical in the development of this RFA because she's the one that came up with the mechanism because she too wants to find something that's short, sweet, to the point, not too complicated, gives you flexibility so you don't have to come back to us every time you want to do something different. So we're trying to maximize the flexibility. Liz McNair, who helped us get this mechanism through the Office of Extramural, and as always, Linda Bass for the application structure and review considerations, always for children's environmental health. I don't know if you know it, but she has done every review for children's environmental health. She's part of the R24 cohort maintenance program. And then Leroy Worth, who is my local chemist meteorologist, who always gives me good advice on how to make things clear and succinct, and especially use all my chemicals in the right terms. And then the translational framework, which this really, I'm sorry, Christy Pettibone, I did not pay attention half the time when you talked about the translational framework, but I have learned so much about it. I think I could probably recite it. Maybe it should be our next pledge of allegiance for our division. But she helped me really put the slides together, to put the thought process together, and really helped me figure out if this was even possible to move the science, that large amount of science, in such a short period of time. So we're going to take baby steps and hopefully make our ways out to that outer ring. And I appreciate all the effort and really putting this in perspective for NAEHS and our science that we fund. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our council reviewers. We've asked Doctors Edith Parker and Andy Shee to offer some pointers, some discussion points about this concept, and I'm going to turn it over to Edith.
Thanks so much. I think my impression is that overall, I think it's an incredibly exciting. I think it's another example of the creativity and the leadership of NAEHS in pushing not only NAEHS grantees, but potentially all NIH grantees by presenting a model. I think it can really address the challenge of translating research by giving resources and emphasis to it. I do think that a lot of folks will be concerned because it's a slightly different model than we've had for the centers and children's centers. And those familiar with the traditional mechanism, this may give concern. Certainly thinking about perhaps less resources for basic or exposure assessment or other research in general. But I do want to point out a couple of things. One, as a member of the original Children's Center, I do remember the same or similar concerns being raised over the CBPR requirement at the time. I think it was here that Brenda Eskenazi said she was the one of the ones who came kicking and screaming, and she, in retrospect, thinks it's probably one of the most valuable things that, in her mind, came out of those in terms of really giving that emphasis that helped the science. Also, as a member of one of the original children's centers that were not refunded, I want to point out, and I think the slide showed that there are, while centers are great for so many reasons, and the resources and the combined resources, there are a lot of other mechanisms and funding sources. We were able at Michigan to keep our portfolio alive with R01 that sort of brought us all together. So there are mechanisms out there. But in terms of, I think, the strengths, obviously the integration basic epidemiological expertise with the expertise in health communication, that's probably been missing. I mean, most centers had it, but I think the emphasis of requiring it will be great. I think the emphasis on reaching outside of local center expertise may really add a lot, but will be a challenge, I think, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I like the training of investigators really early on with the team science, stakeholder engagement, translational lens, which really can be transformative, I think, for environmental health sciences going forward. And also the involvement of stakeholders up front, and I'm sure Andy will talk to that. Certainly some areas of clarification that I think we'll have to have going forward is sort of what are the impacts and deliverables, and who is the target audience? It seemed from your slide, Kim, that a lot of it for curriculum development might be clinicians, but then there's also mention of policymakers. There's advantages of keeping it vague, but also you might want to be a little bit more explicit about who it is that you're wanting to translate to. And I think some issues that may arise, and you may want to, again, not be as definitive on this, but what's the expectations for things such as the guidelines on percent of direct costs that will go to each component, or within the pilot grant mechanism, you mentioned both environmental, epidemiological exposure, basic science, and communication science. Do you want to set guidelines up for pilot grants, or do you want to just leave it to the investigators to figure out what they need to do to have the most success, thinking about renewal coming up and also impact of the centers? I also think that that it's remembering that there is a lot of broader NIH activities in dissemination and implementation science, and that wasn't mentioned here, so there might be, how could you link in? I know NCI has done quite a lot in that area to sort of expertise for that, for sort of interventions, and maybe that's another area that's included in the health communications as a suggested team member or an option for that. And I really like this tapping into national expertise, and I know there's mention of this being a regional center. I'm still trying to get my head around how to do that, because most of the centers have been focused locally with issues there, and yet sometimes I know other emerging issues come that center may not have expertise. So I think that's going to be really important of how to emphasize that people will tap into other national expertise in environmental health sciences, so that they can then use their expertise in health communication to serve as that regional or national expertise. So I'll just stop there and hand it over to Andy.
Thank you, Edith.
Thank you, Kim, for that great presentation. I share Edith's enthusiasm for this program, and I guess I'd like to offer, in addition to the fact that I second her perspective on really the features of the program in terms of knowledge mobilization, providing some implementation guidance for community, the extramural outreach, as well as the cross-sectoral collaboration and knowledge synthesis, I think is potentially very exciting. And of course, the mentoring, capacity building, and the ability to pilot and evaluate interventions are also highlights for me. And I think the additional perspective I'd like to offer is really from a community stakeholder perspective. So, oftentimes, as Authon speaks, and I know other philanthropic organization that supports research, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to really communicate the latest scientific finding to our stakeholders, to make it relevant to them. And of course, the reason for doing this is to both, promote better outcome, but also to provide a target for advocacy, more efficient, more effective advocacy. And many of the NIEHS investment, obviously I'm most familiar with ones related to autism and disability. For example, the work that was mentioned earlier by people like New Schaefer and Heather Volk and so on. We appreciate that some science are not quite ready for prime time. But we often scratch our head about thinking about what do you do with information about, for example, air pollution and risks, increasing autism risk, and even the less, replicated study involving pesticides and autism risk, and so we actually even funded programs from Hopkins researcher to help us how to digest and to present important scientific outcome to advocacy community, stakeholder community, for them to use. So I think in that context, this is all very welcome. But I guess the thing that really kind of was interesting to me is that I think one of the justification for this initiative is that even though this work has been supported by the community stakeholders and advocates, welcomed by them, but it seems to be largely ignored by the mainstream practitioners. And I feel that there's a disconnect between the advocates and the researcher in that sense, because for us, we have always used scientific outcome as a powerful tool to enhance our advocacy. So certainly the prevalence statistics and even the more recent whole genome sequencing efforts that we've done in terms of influencing clinical practice has been very powerful impetus for the community. And so targeting professional and mainly in this initiative, maybe you don't intend to do this, but it feels like that you are saying that maybe we cannot pay as much attention to the community advocate in this whole context of activities, because I think this is a question about target audience here. especially if you only use things like social media, if you understand the power of social media, it's not going to be the primary audience of social media, from our perspective, is not going to be the professionals that you're trying to reach. It's going to be the community. And so then how do you use that community advocacy in this context to not only accelerate but enhance the impact of the translational work that you do? I think something that I would like to, consider a little bit more.
Okay, thank you, both of you, for those thoughtful comments. And now I'd like to open it up for a more general discussion. Bob.
Thanks. I really like this idea of moving towards translational science. One of the stakeholders, I'm a pediatrician, and a common question I get if I give a community talk is, how come my pediatrician doesn't know anything about this? Or how come when I ask him or her about, environmental phthalates or something, they look at me like I have three heads. And there's a lot of reasons why that is, but one of it is medical education doesn't include environment. And I'm wondering if an additional core might be a medical education core that would require maybe residency directors to be involved. They're all academics. They all have to get promoted. Being a co-core leader or a part of a grant actually is going to be enticing to them. And it might actually be a way to get into the curriculum, by engaging them, by having them part of this process. And personally, I think you would benefit by making that mandatory. I really think, I think they would jump at the chance because they're all looking to get promoted. And this would help them get promoted. And I think at that point, once they're engaged, one of the problems with it is that, the boards don't include, American Board of Pediatrics don't include questions on environmental health. Those are the people that write the questions. If they're engaged, I would predict that then going forward, there's going to be some momentum and possibly a snowballing effect where it's going to be on the boards, and even programs that aren't part of this program, residency programs aren't part of this program, are going to start having to teach it. And then you're going to have the materials that they can use. I would strongly urge trying to make those connections, perhaps even also with nursing schools and family medicine residencies as well.
Great, thanks. That's a very good idea. Okay.
Just want to congratulate you and the group. I think this is very thoughtful, and it really takes well into consideration that we are in a different environment that we were, say, when the Children's Center started. And I think that the development of ECHO actually brings a dimension that actually I think that the group have thought very well in terms of a gap and an area that actually could be addressed. So the idea of translation, I think, is great. I was going to comment and sort of echo what Bob said. I'm also a pediatrician, and the idea of including medical training, I would say it's important, but also for other healthcare providers like nursing, and I can tell you that like in immunization, the nurses are key in terms of educating patients. The other part of this is, in addition to included in the medical education of healthcare providers' education, most of the healthcare professionals have to do annual continuing education. And I can tell you that the experience that we have, one example of Puerto Rico with dengue and management of dengue, we were having a lot of death from severe dengue, and had to do with just sort of not understanding the early signs of severe dengue. And it was made a requirement that every physician had to have at least 5 hours of education on dengue, and it was run by CDC. And after that, and everyone got trained, we basically have not had any death in the last about 5 years or so. And so bring that continuing education could be also a very important way of addressing, bringing new knowledge that for those that already are in practice.
Okay, thank you. There were some other hands up here that I might have missed. So Katrina, and then Sue, and Maureen.
I'm going to read my comments because I tried to make them as concise as possible, so apologies for that. So I have 3 points. One is about the framing of translation as communication research. The second is about the developmental component, and the third is about the target or the endpoint for the translation. So my overall, I'm very supportive of the idea. I definitely think it needs to move forward, but I have a couple of suggestions about how to frame and define things that I think will be helpful, because it's a change, and how to operationalize that will be complicated. So my biggest concern is that the high-level summary appears to perpetuate the vision of translation as one way, and NIEHS is a leader in acknowledging and developing the importance of two-way engagement for translation to communities, practice, and policy in order to be ethical, equitable, and effective. And I encourage you to bring this perspective more strongly into view. I think that reflects what Andy was saying as well. And the development and support and facilitation of partnerships, especially at the local level, has been far more effective, particularly from an equity standpoint, than communication. So, the rationale for focusing on communication that's not the key endpoint or outcome for translation of environmental health research. Reducing environmental exposures is, and that often requires changing environmental management, pollution prevention, and exposure reduction. Also, particularly, I'm not a communication researcher, I'm a policy scientist, but as I interact with education and communication researchers more and more, I recognize that as an intellectual endeavor and disciplinary focus is very different from doing and evaluating the practice of health communication. So we can have additional discussion on the differences between those two things and whether it really is the role of NIEHS to be investing in the development of educational theory. But the specific implication for this is I'd rather see that the co-lead be a translation and engagement professional, could be a social scientist, a health education practitioner, a public health a professional or evaluation expert, rather than the really quite narrow category of a communication researcher. So the second point is about the developmental component. It really has two set functions: pilot projects for new research and development of translational approaches. Those two kinds of pilot processes are fundamentally different, and they require different prioritization strategies, review criteria, reviewers, allowable expenses, and even formats. Researchers can do their research with a student or technician time. Social scientists need faculty time, which is seldom allowed under a pilot mechanism. For that reason, I recommend separating those two functions within the developmental component. I've never seen a program where those two are the competition between translational or social science projects for the same funds as research actually results in the desired integration of those functions without some very clear criteria and incentives. So the last point is about the translational endpoints or targets. So at its core, focusing on children's environmental health makes a lot of sense for the reasons you've mentioned. Children are more vulnerable, the impacts on their health are most immediately observable, and the social costs are politically pretty appealing to highlight. But this isn't necessarily true of the translational implications. So yes, translation of educational messages at an individual level is critical, but we always start our public health classes by saying the only case that we can show evidence where education alone has made a difference is in condom use. Everything else has required a lot more action. So the population health messaging about prevention of exposure is not exclusively child-focused. So my concern is that the term children's environmental health research translation tends to focus specifically on that clinical focus. So yes, it is very important to educate healthcare providers, to screen, educate, and refer, but by its nature, this clinical focus emphasizes individual action over community engagement, awareness, and policy action. So I think the CEH research translation needs to have a broader scope to engage the whole community, all vulnerable populations, and perhaps change in terminology there. So in summary, I absolutely agree that we need children's centers. And of course, I think the focus on translation and using our new framework is essential. The co-director structure is admirable, and the effort to balance resources for broad translational activities is innovative and promising. But I encourage clarification of the goals of these translational functions and making sure that the structures, staffing, and guidelines appropriately support those goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrina. Okay, Shikmay, you wanted, and Sue next. Yeah, sorry.
I don't have my thoughts quite that well organized. but Kim, I have two questions that I hope you could maybe comment on. The first, I'm even listening to the discussion after your presentation, I'm still confused about exactly what types of things the pilot projects would cover. If it's developing new, intervention or translation strategies or things like that, or if it also includes more like basic mechanistic science or epidemiology or, related to the questions that are of concern for the outreach. I'm not advocating one or the other. I
Right.
just want to be clear on what it is. And then the other thing is that when I first looked at your concept in your slides, I thought this sounded kind of a lot like a P30 kind of center, but then as I heard your presentation, I backed up from that because it sounded different. But I'm really not very familiar at all with the P2C and the U2C, and I wondered if you could just say a few words about what those are. I mean, I think this is a wonderful idea. I'm really excited about it, but there's just some pieces of it I don't understand at this point.
Sure. So Claudia and David used the U2C to develop the resource infrastructure known as CHEER, which is here. So that's the community at large needs this resource, which is the laboratory examining the chemicals, reporting back, and the statistical analysis. The reason we selected this one, unlike all the other P mechanisms, which were either infrastructure like P30s or they were the P50s, which are multi-project, the P2C, and where I heard about this, was really used from NICHD as a model for where they would take a scientific theme, like I think the newest one on the street is children's rehabilitation program, where they take the science and they collectively move it into curriculum development. But it's more than just NICHD, it's NINR. A lot of others join that, and they kind of require, this is the area that we support in research and that we want to move. So I was actually emulating and as well as I think alcohol and NIAA uses it as well, where they take a body of science and they want to translate that science. So it is an infrastructure. So you're losing that opportunity for that model that everyone's familiar with, 3 research projects, 2 cores. And now instead of calling them cores, they are calling them components. So everything that you're recommending, like maybe there needs to be something for community engagement, that could be a component, that we still maintain that and we encourage that. I never meant to imply that wasn't of interest. This was just reframing a program that we've had for a very long time so people could see it through a new lens, which was broader than just community engagement. And so what I'm seeing here are multiple components, which are not research components, they're projects. They are components which have some research base to them that are required for translation. So the pilot project has been used 2 ways. It is used like a P30 to generate new ideas, but it's based on what's needed for the translation. So if you're stuck because this risk communication can't happen because of X, Y, and Z, you can go back to the test bed. And actually, I thought the pilot project was really important. If you guys were looking outside of the university for collaborations, that would be your collaborative space for interdisciplinary science, is what I thought. And I did think of a separate line, a component for other research endeavors that wasn't just interdisciplinary science. And so I was trying to divide it up and sparse out, and I know it's going to be very difficult, but unlike the P30, that's very institutional specific, so Mount Sinai has one, USC has one, and that's for they have 3 environmental research project that makes them eligible, and it's developing cores for their university. It is for the better of the science, but this I look as broader, and that the makeup would be broader than just USC. It would be other expertise coming from wherever they need to develop a good, strong base, and that they were ready, have some things that were ready for translation and some things that were percolating, and you could test some of those ideas in that pilot project.
Okay. So can I just ask a follow-up question? So what those components are is not. Get closer to the microphone. Oh, sorry. So you can define what those components are. The P2C doesn't say you need a translation.
It does not. It does not. The only thing it requires is administrative core, so somebody's managing it. We looked at other things that are called PL2s, where they are linked projects, but those are still research projects. This is the only one that's not research focused. And that's where the conundrum comes, is trying to find a nice thing that dovetails with what we want to do with that base of untranslated children's environmental health, or those messages and ideas that just still need some enabling for translation.
Thank you. This is a very broad mechanism, and every institute who chooses to use it, fits it to what they are trying to do and the goals of their program. You also can have a cooperative part of it. And so one of the things we talked about was whether there needed to be, some closer direction with the NIEHS priorities for which topics or how to translate, or to, be able to constantly come in and change it up. If we focused in one year a lot on medical education, then using a U, we would be able to change into a different direction depending on what the needs for the various communities were. So we're interested in your feedback on the pros and cons of those things, but we haven't decided exactly which one to use. So I'm going to keep going this way, because a lot of people still had their hands up. So you're at the end of the table. You're going to have to wait your turn. And I want everybody to be able to have something to say, and I want us to hear all of your comments, because it's really important on how we frame this. But we do have to vote, and I really need to sort of move this so we vote. I have to say keep on time. So if we can have another 10 minutes of discussion, because we have one more concept before lunch. Okay, so next here, Maureen. Yeah. Yeah, so quick points are good, and then you can always give us more information after we're done.
Kim, congratulations. There's so much that you touch that is successful, and this one is too. So congrats.
Thank you.
So 3 points real quick. This is an opportunity to build in, and I see Christy sitting there, enterprise evaluation upfront.
Right, absolutely. Christy Pettibone. Yes.
Good. Right. Second, on the target audiences, there are a number of built-in partners that you could work with, and building on Bob's issue, AAMC, ASPPH. There is a Society for Interprofessional Education that brings together medicine, public health, nursing, pharmacy, and dentistry. And so if you're looking at integrated education from a more health professions perspective, those are ready partners. Particularly focusing on, for example, there's a National Primary Care Association, if you want to bring it down so that referrals actually make sense when they go to the pediatrician. There is an Association of Federally Qualified Health Centers. So those are all ready-made partners for curriculum development, if you're thinking about that. And then the third point is about when you do evaluation, and typically we do evaluation whether it's enterprise or another way. In this case, performance evaluation and competency-driven curricula really become key to see whether there's indeed an uptake, whether it's a CME required or some other credential unit. And then lastly, there is a true opportunity here to evaluate how we build up and how we increase environmental health literacy.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Jose, and then Aracima, and then we're going to go this way.
So very interesting. So you talked a little bit about curricular development, and Jose talked a bit also about continuing education for healthcare professionals. I find the timing of this interesting because at my institution, the University Senate just approved a mandate that in general education courses, there must be environmental literacy as part of it. So I could see this going even at the undergraduate level. So now every undergraduate at UConn must have a course that has a environmental literacy component. And also for accreditation purposes for professional schools, pharmacy, medicine, dentistry, one of the accreditation standards is interprofessional education. And I can certainly see, so these are courses in which, you have all students that are, healthcare professionals or wanted to become healthcare professionals or students in allied health, that they take a course together as a group. And I could see children's health and environmental children's health as an important component of these two elements that I just presented.
Okay, thanks.
I work with a community called Familias Unidas del Chamizal. They're very poor. They're immigrants. They're predominantly Spanish speaking. They live close to the International Bridge, so they're affected by the inordinate truck traffic. They also live close to a recycling facility that processes metals and steels and electronics. And when it rains and there's dust, all of this dust is all over the place. Obesity, diabetes, and asthma are rampant in this community in children. The families are poor and they struggle to get good food to the table because they live in a food desert as well. Parents are reluctant to let their children go outside and play because of the bad air quality, which triggers their asthma. And sometimes the only healthcare provider these children see are the school nurse. And I think school nurses are critical in this because they have a lot of information. One of my students, Amit Raizoni, did a study correlating the incidences of asthma attacks in schools and air quality. And he found a very strong correlation. And I think school districts need to be a part of this. Some of these parents are overwhelmed with how do we help deal with, these complicated healthcare issues. And taking them to the doctor is not really an option because they don't have insurance. And so it's really a complicated issue. So I think the more that we can do to also address the structural impediments to good health and good environment is critical.
All right, thanks. Lynn?
So first and foremost, I just wanted to say how excited I am to see this framework actually being brought to a real science process to generate the kind of research that I think needs to be done in order to make this framework something that becomes not only, something that guides the NIEHS, but I'd hope that all of the NIH can begin to appreciate this as being what translational science is really about, that it's not just to the bedside, it's not just to the clinic, which also brings me to a point. I also am a pediatrician, and I've been involved over many years in training pediatricians in environmental health and pushing that, but I don't think it's just about training clinicians. That, I think translation certainly is about changing clinical practice, but in a way that's the most obvious thing that it's about, because it's also about, groups of patients and consumers and communities, and I didn't see it on your slide, but also changing the behavior of industry. I could see a possibility of a project that is there not to change a government policy, but to change how an industry decides how it's going to do its work, and that ought to be on the table. And which is to say that I think that it's tempting for us all to give a laundry list of all the things we think is important in our communities, and we'd want to see every project embody all those things. And I would not over-constrain the process by doing something like that. I think it's very, very important to provide the applicants with the ability to customize their approaches around what is, in their judgment, like what you know about your community there on the board, or what in your judgment is important. Believe it or not, what you said about your community, I'd say exactly the same thing about Washington, D.C., and that it's the school nurses. To be honest, I'd say the same words. All of those things, but then I know that's not true everywhere, and I also agree with the point I think that Trish made about the fact that the co-PI might be, a communication scientist, but it might be some other kind of a behavioral scientist. It might be a political scientist, not to over-constrain what the disciplinary focus of the co-PI might be, because we're, I think, discovering what might be possible to achieve, by taking this kind of scientific approach. And then I have a micro point, which is that I do know about QC awards. We have them. And I like the U mechanism for the kind of thing that you're doing. It actually is a very workable mechanism for academics. And I think that we've done a fair amount of that with the NICHG, the NIDDK, other institutes. And even though NIEHS hasn't used them, they're good mechanisms. So I just wanted to support that.
Okay, great. Brad, and then Bob, and then vote.
Okay, I'll be pithy.
Before that.
I like the broader discussion that I heard from our last few discussants regarding other methods of implementation. I'm really concerned about an over-focus on education as being effective in translation, because it's assuming that the pediatrician, that if you just educate the pediatrician, that will solve the problem. pediatricians have 5 to 10 minutes per patient. The problem isn't just about education, it's about the practicality of actually implementation in practice. So I think that the broader ideas around implementation would be very much more likely to be effective in this kind of mechanism.
Okay, thanks. Bob?
So I'll be very quick. I think reading the room, I think there's a lot of excitement about the research translation aspect of this and the focus. And the only additional comment I'd make beyond what's been said is I wonder about the developmental core supporting epi or basic science research that actually seems a bit like off theme. And I wonder if any research that's supported at the pilot stage might actually be restricted to CBPR or policy-based or some form of education across whatever stakeholder that we're targeting, because they're all important. And I wonder if that might actually make it a little more focused. Because I actually think it'd be weird to have a basic science pilot grant supported by this, or even an epi.
We've heard a lot of comments around the pilot, and so one take-home message for us is to do more work around defining the pilot projects and really figure out what the best approach to them will be for this project. So I don't want to answer that particular little question because I think it's in a bigger context. So before we vote, Linda gets to say something.
So,
and ask a question,
I think what I'm hearing is a lot of excitement about the idea of forming a translational Children's Environmental Health Center. I think it's an opportunity for us to take advantage of the $1 billion of research we've spent over the years, or the $100 million that we just spent last year, and really move it out into the field. And I'm very excited about that. So while we don't have the traditional Children's Environmental Health Center, we've got $95 million of work doing children's environmental health research, basic epidemiology, and so on. Mike, I was wondering if you wanted to comment at all. We would very much, Kim talked a little about our opportunities to partner with our other federal partners, and we've had a long history, a successful history of partnering with EPA and children's environmental health, and this is moving it into just a different aspect of children's environmental health, and I'd like, Mike, if you'd want to make a comment or two.
Right. Excuse me. Thank you, Linda. You are definitely moving in the right direction. We really like this approach. In fact, as EPA revises 6 of our national research programs, the heart of our research planning is translational work. So we very much support this approach, this concept. There are lots of good questions raised by the council, but we very much support this. The relationship that EPA has had with NAEHS and the Children's Health Centers for 20 years has been fantastic. Our budget issue is unfortunately not as robust as yours, and it's actually much more, shall we say, it's hard for us to make a commitment given the fact that the President's budget has our grants program zeroed out. As much as fortunately, the Congress over the last 2 years has not seen fit to zero us out. Our Comptroller's Office won't allow us to make a commitment with you guys because of that President's budget request. So it's just very unfortunate. But the relationship has been fantastic. And of course, we have our own, and Linda knows this well, we have our own internal children's health program and research that I think we'd love to work with you guys as you implement this concept.
Absolutely. I couldn't imagine this program without EPA.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, so if it's like 1 second, and then we're going to vote. Okay? Go.
Okay, this is really outside the box. What about business translation through integration with small business and also entrepreneurship? So that will be another level of translations that is completely outside the public health and also clinical setting.
Okay, thank you. I really do appreciate all of the good comments, and we never intend at a concept level to bring you a finished product with all of the things worked out. There's no reason to do that. We really value all of your experience and your vision and lens on what we're trying to do. So, with that said, can somebody make a motion to approve the concept? Thank you. Okay. All right. Now, hand votes. So, all in favor. Okay, we have counted. Okay, thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, so I just want to say this concept has been approved by council. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Kim.
Thank you. Thanks for all your help.
Okay, Sema, you're up next. One more before lunch.
To make this an entire meeting from Population Health Branch, we will continue. So I am here today with Liam O'Fallon to present our concept for renewal of the Research to Action program. We believe that it exemplifies equity in community academic partnerships and is a program that empowers both community members to participate in research and investigators to conduct community-engaged research in culturally appropriate ways. I say we, as this entire presentation and concept were co-developed with Liam and with a great deal of input and assistance from Takara Chamberlain, who has recently joined our branch. The existing projects and completed ones have addressed many critical environmental health risks plaguing communities nationwide, and many different populations the most at risk from environmental factors. However, gaps exist in what issues are addressed and which communities are served by such research. In addition, we envision a program that would be nimble enough to incorporate research on new environmental threats or the increasing environmental problems associated with the changing climate. This morning, I'll provide some background, specifically which strategic goals are addressed by the program, where our current projects and dollars are going, and some programmatic highlights of the existing projects. We currently have 13 funded research to action projects. Liam will present our plans for a reissued program announcement, budget, and timeline. I will not, however, be going over the scientific justification in great detail, which we feel we covered thoroughly in our background concept document. What we do want to do, though, is to provide evidence that environmental factors continue to raise risk for public health in the U.S., and that often these risks are disproportionately distributed among specific populations or age groups. Well-publicized exposure to toxic substances remains a major public health risk. The Gen X issue has already been alluded to. Gen X and other chemicals released into North Carolina rivers represents an indiscriminate exposure that has affected many diverse communities and more than 200,000 people who rely on the Cape Fear River for their drinking water. They first learned of the threat in June 2017, and the chemical has since, and Gen X and other chemicals have since been discovered in hundreds of private wells near the facility. Our second example on this slide are PFAS. A just-released report has called on the U.S. Congress to ban the use of PFAS in firefighting foam, following an investigation into the product's use by the Department of Defense. The report had identified more than 100 military sites where drinking water or groundwater is contaminated with PFAS at levels above the EPA's health guidelines. However, environmental health disparities continue to exist as well. Class 2 wells that receive fracking wastewater are disproportionately situated in lower income and rural community areas with the greatest social vulnerability. The disproportionate effects of air pollution exposures from the built environment, goods movements, or proximity to major roadways are also related to race and ethnicity. Latino groups migrating to the U.S. often work in farming, industry, and domestic cleaning jobs, and these occupations are often the most harmful in terms of environmental exposures. Research among farm workers that we have funded has shown the consistently negative impacts of pesticide exposures among workers and their families. We also increasingly see disproportionate exposures among newly immigrated Asian subpopulations, such as Vietnamese, working in nail salons or other small industries. This program reflects a number of key strategic themes of our institute. For example, the translation of knowledge and its use by the public are primary goals of the Research to Action program. This includes outreach, communications, and engagement with all relevant stakeholder communities and the sharing of new findings with affected groups. Attention to emerging health threats, this program will help maintain our strong commitment to addressing new and emerging environmental health issues. And the importance of partnerships for action. Such partnerships are central to the success of the Research to Action projects. We feel that it relates to professional pipeline. The projects to date have been very successful at recruiting and training the next generation of the environmental health science workforce. Several have included diversity supplements, and others have worked closely to train local community partners in research, analysis, and translation of findings. And the program has also promoted collaborative science approaches that work across disciplines. Most Research to Action projects include a variety of scientific expertise. The goals of the program are to support community-engaged research to prevent or reduce harmful exposures and improve health, to use multidisciplinary collaborative approaches, and to implement a public health action plan based on the research findings. Our overarching goals for this program also reflect our deep commitment to true community engagement. Programmatic requirements, therefore, will continue to include that communities play a role in identifying and defining the problem and risks related to environmental exposures and stressors that are of the greatest importance to them. Communities will receive financial and scientific support necessary to conduct high-quality research in partnership with investigators that will accurately characterize the distributions and sources of the environmental exposures and exposure health relationships in their community, and empower all involved to take action to reduce these potential health risks. Communities will collaborate with the researchers in developing effective strategies for training, education, communication, remediation, and prevention in response to environmental threats in order to reduce or eliminate such exposures and to improve health outcomes in these communities. And community members will ensure that strategies and education are provided in accessible, culturally sensitive formats and develop at a literacy level and language appropriate for various subpopulations in these communities. This slide shows the number of applications received and funded to date. 2009 was the original R21 and it was an RFA. The remaining years have been R01 PAR program, meaning we don't set aside money for them. You will note that the success rate has been relatively high. However, the number of these projects that were not funded each year represents not only a challenge to the investigators and their relationship with the communities, but a true disappointment to communities wanting to be involved in research to address their local concerns. I want to show you now that our investment has covered all populations. This includes racial and ethnic subpopulations, Latino, African American, Asian, American Indian, and we're hoping Alaska Native, and all age groups, pediatric, youth, adult, and older adults. It's covered rural and urban environments. And the Research to Action project since 2009 explored all types of environmental stressors, and in many cases, how these stressors combine with social determinants of health, such as economic status, educational level, or cultural background, to increase risk for disease or that represent barriers to effective interventions. And these are some of the health conditions being explored in the current projects that arise from the many different types of exposures the public is experiencing. We would like to see reductions in asthma and respiratory conditions. We would like to address the exposures that lead to behavioral and cognitive abnormalities or cancer, and certainly reduce the risk for cardiovascular disease. We've also been looking at dermal conditions and neurodegenerative disease through these projects. The Research to Action grantees, 13 project teams, including their community partners, have published 71 articles in over 48 different peer-reviewed journals, ranging from American Journal of Public Health to occupational environmental medicine and environmental pollution, among many, many others. I'd now like to briefly highlight 3 examples of research to action projects in Illinois, Washington State, and New York to give you a flavor of what they look at, how they conduct the projects, and some of the outcomes. Oh, sorry, am I behind? Oh, here we go. This ongoing project, promoting healthy seafood choice in Asian communities, is taking place in an urban setting in collaboration with 3 distinct Asian subpopulations: Chinese, Vietnamese, and Cambodian. The academic partners, Susan Buchanan, Mary Turek, and Jin Zhang from the University of Illinois, Chicago, have been working with their collaborators to characterize exposure to mercury and PCBs from fish consumption from urban waterways. The research team found that the 3 subpopulations differed in the types and amounts of traditional fish that they eat. Based on this evidence, they developed consumption advice for women of reproductive age and ensured that messages were tailored to the individual sub-communities' dietary patterns and culturally specific diet practices. The recommendations were based on both mercury and fatty acid levels and were specifically geared to reflect these unique consumption patterns in each of these communities. At the community level, over 82% of seafood meals and 51% of mercury intake was derived from fish recommended as best choices by the FDA. They found that up to 67% of individuals ate more than the recommended 2 to 3 servings per week in these communities, and that as many as 20% of the study participants had mercury intake exceeding EPA reference dose. Their advisory contains additional species that are commonly consumed by these populations that were not on the FDA list and indicates species particularly high in omega-3 fatty acids. The research team modified the FDA's recommended seafood consumption rates, opting to assign points for each seafood group, which allow women to consume seafood equaling up to 4 points per week. The team created an informative webpage in English, Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese, why not Cambodian, to communicate with their audience about both the risks and benefits of consuming fish. As part of this website, they have included the fish list, which provides the ethnic-specific advice to community residents. The team is now moving into the intervention phase. They are texting study participants with their health messages. They've collected and analyzed baseline measures of mercury, and they plan now to follow up with participants to see if there is a reduction in the mercury levels. Our next example is a collaborative project that builds off a long-term community academic partnership in Washington State to address environmental health concerns of rural communities. It's the only original R21 project that was successful in receiving an R01 research to action. It's led by Catherine Carr at the University of Washington. She and her team have been working closely with their community partners to identify sources and characterize and reduce inflammatory agents and allergens that are exacerbating pediatric asthma. In their R21 project, they completed one of the first longitudinal studies of children living in rural communities. They collected repeated lung functions in addition to ammonia exposures related to animal feeding operations. According to the research team, it was the first study of this design to address animal feeding operations, AFO exposures in relation to pediatric health. Findings from their R21 suggested that ammonia may serve as a marker for the complex airborne emissions from AFOs. And particularly, they found significant associations between a measure of lung function, FEV1, and estimated ammonia exposure at subjects' home. Interestingly, the respiratory effect was most severe 1 or 2 days after the exposure. The R21 project is responding to community input about these original findings. The team developed an intervention protocol to see how combining asthma education with the placement of HEPA filters in the child's sleeping area and living area would affect health outcomes. They are in year 5 of this project and will soon have data on the effectiveness. The research team has been translating their research findings into outreach materials for patients, clinical providers, local health jurisdictions, and the public to provide alternatives for control, elimination, or avoidance of exposure. One of their community partners is a local radio station, which has been very effective at reaching people in this rural community. Our final example is about reducing exposures to soil contaminants from urban gardening, which is just burgeoning across the country. So communities in New York City and elsewhere in New York State had identified several needs related to soil contamination and public health. That included requests for further education, research, and the creation of a vehicle for better communication. This project addressed these local concerns via soil testing, preparation of educational materials, and training for gardeners. The research team characterized contaminant levels in more than 80 gardens, more than 1,000 soil samples, 200 fruit and vegetable samples, and 60 egg samples. They conducted an exposure assessment that showed that 10% of gardeners and 40% of visiting children had the potential of exceeding FDA provisional tolerable intake for lead, primarily due to vegetable consumption on the part of the gardeners, but ingestion of soil and associated dust among the children. The team found that garden beds, which are often amended with clean soil and compost, had lower levels of lead and other metals than non-growing areas, and that raised beds had even lower levels than gardens planted directly in the ground. Based on these assessments, the researchers developed and widely distributed extension outreach programming to help gardeners and stakeholder groups reduce risk, partially remediated the most contaminated gardens with clean soil, identified future research needs, and initiated a dialogue regarding development of health protective policies for community gardens in New York. The team also responded to growing interest in urban chicken coops and the risks associated with that. They collected soil samples from chicken runs and tested chicken eggs. Lead was detected in 48% of the chicken egg samples. However, only one sample had levels that exceeded a food standard. Measures of lead in eggs from a hen house were significantly associated with lead concentrations in soil. And while the lead levels they found in New York City eggs would not significantly increase health risk for a typical consumer, the health risk may be increased for a child frequently eating eggs at the highest level measured in this study. These findings were picked up by the New York Times, prompting the team to respond to this unanticipated publicity by developing a set of best practices aimed at chicken keepers. I'm now going to turn over the presentation to my esteemed colleague Liam, who will talk to you about what our plans are for the future.
Sorry.
Thank you very much, Sima. I know I'm standing between us and lunch, so I'm going to make this really quick. Sima has done a really exceptional job of setting the stage for the continuance of the Research to Action program. It has been successful on many levels, and now we want to assure that we sustain the positive advances in environmental public health through the community-engaged research and research that leads to action. So I'm going to be here to talk about the proposed program updates, mechanisms, timeline and budget, and have some time for discussion. So Sima showed the program goals. I'm not going to reiterate them. They're going to remain the same. In keeping also our commitment to the community engagement, ensuring that they have the voice in terms of determining what those important environmental exposures are of greatest concern to them. So if we're not changing this, what are we changing? Well, basically what we're going to be doing is making some just very minor tweaks. One of the things that we want to call out is the collaboration with disease advocacy groups. We've seen over time that disease advocacy groups have been instrumental in contributing to the translation of science in different program areas, such as Breast Cancer Environment Research Program, as well as with the Children's Environmental Health Centers. And while they have not been excluded from the previous issuance of the RFA, we want to specifically call out their contributions to the Research to Action program. The other more significant change is really more of a change in the type of funding opportunity announcement. We're proposing to use a request for application. I'll slow down just a little bit here. Because with this, changing to a request for application, this allows us to have one receipt date. With the PA, we have been getting them on every council round. This brings it into one time, which will enable program staff at NAEHS to look at the group as a whole, right? We'll be able to look at geographic considerations, the different types of issues, whether it's the exposure, the health outcomes, the general concerns that are being addressed. Also, it brings together the group as a cohort of grantees. They see themselves working together. They're coming in at one time. From another programmatic perspective, as well as review perspective, it provides better control of the review. As shown in this particular screen capture right here, through the PA, the proposals have been coming into almost 7 different study sections at CSR. Clearly, the higher levels have been at the community influences on health behavior, CIHB, shown the tall bar there, and then community level health promotion, CLHP, have been receiving the most number of proposals. But again, they're distributed over a wide number, and by issuing one RFA, doing an in-house review, that allows us to bring them all together and have a little bit more control over that. And the review would be conducted here at NAEHS through our scientific review branch under the leadership of Alfonso Lotoni. The other benefit of changing it to an RFA is it really makes a statement in terms of having a set-aside amount of funding for the program itself. It sends a message to our extramural community about our commitment to community-engaged research and the continuation of this particular program. So what it is that we're proposing is an R01 mechanism, issuing the RFA for a 2-year period of time. We had anticipate 4 to 5 awards per round, with total cost with $400,000 direct cost per award per year for a 5-year period of time. So we're looking at about $2.5 million total annually as an investment. So we believe that this request aligns really to looking back at what we've been receiving over the last few years. The timeline is, as you've seen today, pretty tight. I think we're going to be pretty busy over the next few months here. But because we're only making some minor edits to the request for applications, we believe that we can get this solicitation on the street fairly quickly. So we're looking at coming to you here today, publishing the announcement late summer of 2019, receipt fall/winter 2019, review late spring 2020. Similar to Kim, presenting some type of a funding plan September, October of 2020, and hopefully having the project starting in late fall of 2020. We believe that the Research to Action program has exemplified the importance of community engagement and research, and our interactions with the various research teams at grantee meetings and reviewing their progress reports has really demonstrated the value of this effort. And we're pleased to let you know that actually starting tomorrow, our Research to Action grantees are going to be coming here to NAEHS to be highlighting their efforts, their scientific accomplishments, what's been the value of community-engaged research, and the teams are also going to be discussing the ways in which communities have been involved in the research process. So in closing, we want to emphasize that through this new solicitation of the research to action, NIEHS will remain poised to support research that leads to meaningful action and addresses environmental health concerns facing communities across the country, while advancing the science of community-engaged research, building the capacity of all research partners, and strengthening our environmental health literacy for many stakeholders, from community residents, researchers, healthcare providers, as well as decision makers. So, of course, it always takes a team. These are the NIEHS program folks who've been working on this concept. In addition, we've been interacting with other IC folks, IC representatives. National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities has expressed an interest in engaging with us in the Research to Action program. They're discussing it in-house. And typically, we've had other partnerships, including the National Institute for Nursing Research. So it is a team effort. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and open it up to our council reviewers, Maureen Lickfield and Shuk May Ho. And some of you want to come on up here too.
Thanks. Go ahead, Maureen.
Okay, so I can go first. So I really, really want to congratulate Liam and also Sima for this outstanding presentation and also this concept. And it is a very important area of research. I think NIEHS should continue to support research to action. This is important. So with all the positive elements, I just want to point out a couple of things because of the time to lunch. And I break it down into words. So in terms of the research, I think the research should not be restricted to just population-based or more traditional community-based kind of research. It can be expanded to even basic and also mechanistic research. So that's just point number one. So then I take another word, and that word is the community. So I feel that in all the descriptions, including the examples in the concept as well as in the presentation, we focus a lot on our traditional communities like the ethnic and racial subpopulations, the vulnerable populations, and I was delighted to see the immigrants as one of the special populations. So those are all very good. But we don't forget that in this new world that is changing, a lot of these populations could be just important. Like it could just be economic development all of a sudden created a populations that we are not seeing. Like for example, this 5G technologies will create a completely new populations that are at risk of certain electromagnetic sort of impacts that we are not perceiving. So these kind of environmental threats will continue to change as we see economic and also other social changes that is happening very rapidly in our societies, including like facial recognitions and other things that really AI activities that really direct traffics that is going to really be impacting our communities. So that's the second word I would like to address. Then finally, I'd like to take on another word, and that is the action. The action, I think we should not be only limited to public health actions, and also these actions could easily include technology of in targeting industry, working with industries, like for example with 3M's, DuPont, like for example Verizon putting out all these 5Gs and things like that. So this is another target of our action points. And oftentimes we can also look at local areas, including like local audiences and perhaps the churches, perhaps like community leaders, then they can actually be able to do something very effective in terms of actions. And let me just very quickly and pass it on to Maureen, is that I'm actually really have 2 points I want to emphasize. Is the assessing the word assessing, how do we measure the success of the impact of the action? That has to be clearly articulated in these funding mechanisms. And finally, I saw that in terms of the funding level is $400,000 and for 5 years. And for many of these projects, they will be coming in, they could be resolved and have an action and very impactful, but not taken 5 years, and also may not necessarily reach this 400,000 level. So I think we should be limbo in terms of thinking about this and being able to do distribute the more, allowing more fundings to be more projects to be distributed and more variety and cover a broader base instead of limiting to this rigid like 400,000 and 5 years projects. And lastly, I took heart to the DoD reviews. They always involve community participants in their review process. So I'm going to suggest that if it's possible, that we really included one of or several groups of well-trained and well-educated community participants to be part of the review process.
Okay, thank you. And Maureen, and then we'll discuss these ideas.
Well, on behalf of communities who suffer environmental health disparities, thank you. Thank you for making this visible. Thank you for investing in it. It is, so thank you for that. My comments are driven through the lens of communities, and so putting just a little bit aside the researcher in me. The first one is the burden of proof. In the statement, the concept statement, there is language about risks, but at the same and emerging threats, but at the same time also language about causal relationships. One of the frustrating parts for communities is that we can't always get to causal relationships. At best, we can get to potential associations, and so the flexibility there is key for communities to be able to be full partners. The second area where communities are frustrated often is that they're not either there's the risk or there's a completed exposure pathway, not to one, but to multiple chemicals. So the focus and the emphasis on mixtures is important. And then thirdly, in environmental health disparities, as you correctly identify, not only the comorbid conditions, but also the non-chemical stressors, the things that we talked about earlier. So we'll focus on chemical and non-chemical stressors and exposure to those. I think will enrich the profile. You mentioned both informed by communities and engaged by communities, and then community-based participatory research. Just a cleaning up the language of what it is you're really looking for, because you know there are differences between community engaged, community participatory, and community informed. And then next is, I have been successful in using climate and health, and climate and the consequences of health, rather than the more known and perhaps tax term of climate change. And then much last, I really congratulate you in including environmental health literacy. And while you put STEM students in brackets, I'm hoping you don't mean that it's not eligible to be included. So thank you.
I did want to respond to one of Chuck May's comments. One of the current projects has partnered with the local industry that is the source of the exposure, and it has been most successful at a more local level. You mentioned large corporations, which is quite a big bite. But this is a project that's working with local metal recyclers, individual small businesses who are changing their practice because they're involved in the project. So I completely agree with you that that is a target partner for these projects. Thank you. And thanks to both of you for your comments. We've been writing them down.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to say one thing, and then I'll call on you. Just so you know that when we put in these targets for dollar amounts and time, it's never the rule that grants have to come in at that level. It's the maximum. It's the maximum, the dollars and maximum years. My experience over time is that most people use those as targets, and we very rarely see in a proposal that could be 5 years, a 3-year study, or, a $250,000. But of course, we would love to see the diversity because that helps us make choices and, move science and public health more quickly. But just wanted to clarify that. Okay, Marla?
And I think that should be encouraged because that will give a diverse, because some of these
We'll put
projects-
language in
yeah.
there about that.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And I have 2 questions. My first question is if it will be required to publish the results in non-peer review venues. Maybe if the community is involved in the research, the community should be involved as well in deciding the ways in which the research is published. And my second question or comment is if the program considers funding research, basic research, or interventions that go beyond the individual behavioral changes, because most exposures, behavioral changes go so far, and it will need more political organizing in the community to change those exposures, to impact policy and to impact enforcement of that policy. And that is the key to ultimately, decrease the exposure. So is the program?
Yes.
Okay.
The short answer is yes to both. In other words, the community plays a major role in how the information is disseminated. I mentioned that one uses a local radio station. The project in New York used the county extension services to disseminate, and they certainly publish newspaper and journal articles. Also, in the peer-reviewed publications, we encourage the teams to include the community members in those publications as well. So the answer is yes to that. The second one, yes, some of the interventions very much are intended to go beyond individual responsibility for reducing or eliminating the exposure. Many have a policy goal. Many involve decision makers. That is very much a part of what this program is about. I appreciate you commenting on that.
Yeah, as someone who used to do state public health and had a lead program, so hearing about the lead example really got me stirred up. And I was just wondering if the grantees are asked to formally connect, with public health around issues like that. I mean, lead in soil residentially is a public health problem that extends beyond the boundaries of the yard where somebody's trying to grow their vegetables and usually involves an entire community and is a public health issue that needs to be addressed by the government. But also, I would say, you had me frantically looking at this, FDA standard, the 100 parts per billion standard, because I know that these tolerances that FDA uses, with due respect to our colleagues from the FDA who are in the room, but those were developed at an earlier era in terms of our understanding of lead toxicity. And my, admittedly back of the envelope calculations say that they're about 10 times too high for today. And that actually that egg would easily, as a pediatrician, I could say, be consumed by a single child, one single egg. So I'm concerned about that. And I think that but that underlines the need to involve public health, because this goes beyond, does it meet a standard? Is it in this person's yard?
Sure, thank you for those ideas. Let's do our last question and then we can.
Oh, I wanted to respond to that.
All right, just do one more question and you
Okay.
can respond to both of them. Maybe they'll be on the same topic. Katrina, go ahead. Press your button.
This is a really important program. Thank you for moving it forward. I think we need to restate how critical moving this to in-house review is, because there are threefold expectations of having a robust partnership, generating new knowledge, and action. And that means the interpretation of the words in scientific merit and research approach is fundamentally different from your typical R01. I think that's, as you've seen, a real challenge to the study sections, and I'm really excited about the potential solution you've come up with. These projects require multiple disciplines, community partners, complex translation and dissemination impacts on top of sample collection, lab analyses, lab costs necessary to make significant contributions to scientific knowledge. This suggests to me that the cap should be higher, not lower, than a typical R01. So I'm curious about the rationale for 400K. And also taking a longer time, because if you want action, especially into the beyond communication realm, and I wonder if you might have some innovative strategies that you can't control through this, but flipping the order of the R01 and the R21, where you have an implementation and dissemination R01 after the completion of the main grant to accomplish that.
Interesting comment. I want to respond first to yours. One of the most successful projects came out of the California Public Health Institute, and they are so plugged into the statewide public health departments that other communities are asking for that project to be extended to their communities. When I get grant inquiries, I encourage that. I don't think we can require it. This is based on who comes to the investigator and who the community thinks should be the partners. It often is a public health official involved in the projects. We would have to discuss whether we should require that, but it certainly is an element of the existing program. We've also, Katrina, been talking, we agree with the in-house review being critical, and also the once-a-year reviews to have more of a sense of a program. We did a quick analysis of the actual costs, and we saw that not all of them came to 500K, and so we are thinking of lowering that cap. However, the issue about the length of time, many of them go into no-cost extension. I myself would not want to peel off the dissemination to a different project. We want it integrated, and we want it to be an element of the original study design. We're gathering this evidence, and also because the dissemination starts from the beginning. They have community forums to describe what they're going to do and get input at that point. Along the course of the project, they have community forums and educational events and reach out to the community, not necessarily with preliminary findings, but about the conduct of the research, which helps build the capacity of more people in those communities. So the dissemination begins right from the beginning of the project. But it's an interesting idea, and thank you for that comment.
Okay, so I'm going to call the vote, and then we can keep talking over lunch. So can I have a motion to, thank you, second? Okay, all in favor, please raise your hand. Okay. Thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. This concept
Thank you
has
all
been
very
approved
much.
by council.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we are going to take an hour for lunch. We'll be back at 1:20.